Hello and welcome to BBC Parliament's recorded coverage when the Select Committee rose. The Scottish Affairs Committee continued their inquiry, which they have called the Referendum on Separation for Scotland. They heard from academics and analysts of the defence industry.
Well, gentlemen, could I very much welcome you to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee. We're undertaking a series of investigations into different issues connected with separation for Scotland. We've produced some reports on issues relating to the process, but we also want to have discussions and produce reports about issues relating to substance, and today is on the question of defence. I wonder if I could start off just by asking you to introduce yourselves for the record and tell us your background. Can we start from this end?
I'm Hew Strachan, and I am Professor of the History of War at Oxford. I suppose relevant for this committee is when I was at Glasgow, I set up the Scottish Centre for War Studies in 1997, and indeed in 1999 we had a conference on the implications of devolution and independence for defence in Scotland.
I'm Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the Research Director at the Royal United Services Institute in London. I'm a Scot by origin and birth, but educated and worked most of my career in England.
Francis Tusa, Editor of Defence Analysis, a London-based defence newsletter. I suppose the only reason why I'm here was I've now done 2 fully costed studies of issues to do with devolution, independence and the armed forces, which, all I'll say is the first one I started simply because I thought I wouldn't be able to fill the pages of my newsletter over Christmas and New Year, and rather than writing 3 pages ended up writing close to 15, revisiting the subject this year to update it.
Fine, thanks. Well, look, I wonder if I could start off just by asking what threats to its security do you believe a separate Scotland would face, and how, therefore, it ought to, should it configure its defence forces? Now, maybe I'll start at the same end.
Well, inevitably the question in part relates to what political framework defence is operating in, and the big question I suppose all of us confront on this is, would an independent Scotland be within NATO or not? Because I think that would actually both affect its defence posture and also affect its the sort of security roles and the military roles it might want to undertake. But if we're thinking simply in defensive terms, obviously the truism that we live in an extraordinarily secure age, and we happen to live in an extraordinarily secure part of the world at the moment, holds true. And if you viewed it purely in defence terms, then the obvious threats would be terrorism, etc., etc. I think I would add to that, though, the implications of what might happen in the Arctic. That seems to me relevant to Scotland. It's relevant in terms of Scotland's Scandinavian neighbours, and the possible militarisation of the thawing of the ice cap and the opening up of trade routes across the Arctic, I think have implications certainly for maritime security, and I think maritime security would be the big area. The other big area would be air defence of some sort, presumably the need for Scotland to look after its own airspace, and to do that properly. As I say, going back to my first point, the big question is how far Scotland would feel the need to get into a wider insurance scheme, if you like. My understanding of where the United Kingdom is today is that a lot of what it does, particularly in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq, has been in order to buy into the favour bank in the United States, and that is exactly what a great many other US allies are doing. And what they're doing, of course, is hoping that if they do get themselves into an insecure situation at some point in the future, or a position of greater insecurity, that they'll be able to call that on those favours. And I think that actually is, for me, the core question.
Right, thanks.
Yes, just following on from Professor Strachan's remarks, I think in the short to medium term, the expectation that we're going to get into a war between the UK and another country about the UK's territorial integrity is very far-fetched. And we do, as Professor Strachan said, in many respects live in a particularly secure world. But I think we also live in a world, and the government's strategic defence and security view pointed this out, where there's a lot of uncertainty about where the world might be in 10 or 20 years' time. And of course, independence is, if not forever, for a very long time. So one has to think, in considering the question of the implications for independent Scotland, about where the world might be in 30, 40, 50 years' time. And I think there's every reason to prepare and to think about the possibility of the post-1945 order, which we've lived with for a long period of time, not necessarily being a permanent one. And the Eurozone crisis, I think, is just the latest indication of the uncertainty about where European institutional frameworks will be in 10, 15 years' time. We just don't know the answer to that question. So on one level, one can say that an independent Scotland will simply be another small European state, which is pretty secure, needs some modest provision, but can do that in cooperation with others, as Norway and Sweden, Denmark, Ireland all do, with different positions and different alliances. And the main issues in relation to Scotland would be transition ones, considerable transition ones, but transition ones nevertheless. But I think in the long term, there's also a clear difference between being part of a United Kingdom where there's an entirely equal commitment across that country. So any part of the United Kingdom is threatened in any way, the whole United Kingdom state comes to meet that threat without question. There's no differentiation. To a situation in which Scotland was independent, as the Republic of Ireland is, in which, although there might be a reasonable expectation of their friendly relations and allied relations and common membership of the European Union, of helping when one can, the level of expectation, the level of guarantee would be significantly less if there was independence. And how much less would depend on scenario, would depend on all sorts of things which we're going to talk about. In the immediate future, the next 5 to 10 years, I think the risks one has to take more seriously as a small power would be ones which the military would have a role in, but it wouldn't necessarily be the primary responder. Things like terrorism, cybercrime, fishery protection. If there's a deepening economic crisis in these islands as a result of the Eurozone crisis, there may also be issues of civil disorder, and there's certainly a role for security agencies in relation to that. Whether there's a role for the military is perhaps most questionable. There might also be questions, I think, in relation to Northern Ireland, where it's not, in this hypothetical scenario, Chair, you paint, it's not clear whether Northern Ireland simply stays part of the United Kingdom. It's entirely a problem for London, or whether Scotland might be asked to take some responsibility there.
I'll take a slightly different view. It is very easy at the moment to sit in the United Kingdom and say everything is safe, everything is happy for the foreseeable future. Instead, I would look much more, which I know the SNP have in policy documents, at the likes of Denmark, Norway, Sweden. They are far less sanguine about the next 5 to 10 years. If you look at their defence plans generally, they don't view stuff in the Arctic as a possibility, something that might happen. They view this as, if I say tomorrow's war, they actually do mean tomorrow, and they mean it not might end up shooting war, probably will end up shooting war. They are investing today in both research and development and procurement for that conflict, call it Cold War, call it what you will. So I would, if you were to have an independent Scotland, I'm not necessarily as convinced that there would be a wonderful period of 10 to 20 years for a scenario, a series of threats to work themselves out. Just comparing with other people with interests, Denmark, not a particularly big country, they are investing a huge amount in a completely new navy, all aimed at issues to do with the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. Now, does that mean that an independent Scotland would have to do precisely the same? No. But I would say if you were looking at comparator nations and how they're dealing with things, that's what those nations are doing. And interestingly, although Danish defence expenditure has not been as cut as much as other European countries, not even as much as the UK, Norwegian expenditure is rising significantly, especially in procurement. The Swedes have managed to keep their defence procurement on an upward trend. They're taking hits elsewhere. You have to ask yourselves why they're doing that. If there is no realistic, sensible trend. And if you talk to the Nordic people, especially with the air forces, but also with the naval forces, they will tell you the level of Russian activity, submarine and otherwise. We may not yet see as many backfires and bears coming down the North Sea. If you are based in Kiruna or Luleå, you're seeing a lot more activity. As I say, they have a very different perspective than you might get from London or possibly even from Edinburgh.
Lindsay, you wanted to?
Yes, has there been any indication that the Scottish Government has taken any scenario planning or risk analysis into account in their future defence programme?
I have not seen or heard, despite doing 4 or 5 years on this, and no one's come back and said, yes, they are doing intensive work at all. If anything, over the last 6 to 8 months, if you raise topics of the what-ifs, certainly from the military side, you're met with a very polite smile of, oh, is that the time? And they will move swiftly on. If I were to deduce from that people have been told, don't even get involved, I think that would be a fair comment.
I think what is striking, I mean, going back to this conference we had in 1999, is I see almost no development from that day to this in terms of thinking about these sort of issues and what the implications might be. And of course, the quick and easy response when you ask that sort of question is, it's not our constitutional responsibility, which of course in immediate terms it's not. But as we've just heard, the issue is not about the immediate, it's about the medium to long term. And I mean, the drift of your question is entirely right. There doesn't seem to be any appetite to engage with this sort of serious thinking. And what tends to happen instead, it seems to me, is an engagement with what sort of forces might we need without any sort of context in which those forces might be set. So it begins, partly because it's related to defence industry, it tends to begin with the building blocks rather than think of the context within which those building blocks will be set.
So just to clarify, would you accept there's been almost a vacuum in strategic thinking in terms of the Scottish Government and the defence programme?
Yes, because part because there isn't a defence programme. So there's unlikely to be strategic thinking. But I think there's a wider issue. I mean, both when I was in Glasgow and as I'm still based in Scotland, I've tried to suggest in Edinburgh once or twice that it might be a good idea if we just had a wider international discussion of the sort that you might find going on here at RUSI where Malcolm works or Chatham House. There really isn't much appetite for engagement for it in terms of a security dimension. I mean, there's a great sense of outreach. We want to engage with other countries, but not a sense that these might be issues that involve threats as well as opportunities.
Could I just perhaps add to what Hew said? Clearly, until the issue of the referendum was on the table, the Scottish Government could say, well, it's not our responsibility to look at defence. But we are now in a situation in which it's probable that there will be a referendum of Scottish independence by 2014. And in order for the Scottish people to make an informed judgment as to how to vote, they need to know answers to many questions, one of which is what the implications for defence would be. And I, like Francis, have written a paper on that, which is on the RUSI website, going into some detail about what independence might mean, what are the options for Scotland's independence. And I think it's very healthy, actually, you have a free-flowing debate amongst people not in the Scottish Government about what the different options would be, and indeed people in the Scottish Government as well. The final point I'd make, however, is that there is no single Scottish force structure you could have. There would be, as there are for the UK, different options. And the more in which you think that the primary threat an independent Scotland would face is from the north, from the Arctic, the more you might put emphasis on naval and air forces rather than ground forces.
But it would be fair to say that the referendum has been on the agenda in a serious way since 2007, and even more serious since 2011.
Well, if I just come in on that, a slight not change to what I said earlier, have people looked at, for example, force structures, basing and so forth of units all over the UK? Yes, future army structure, future air force structure, people have looked at this. The whole issue of if you're going for joint strike fighter as opposed to tornado, where might you put bases? these things have been considered. I would say it is only now, when I wrote the first study in 2007, and a lot of people contacted me, subscribers from Scotland, saying it's great they'd seen what I'd done, and saying it's the first time they'd ever seen people looking at a totally blank sheet of paper. But at the time they said, the great mistake I made was I said, right, let's just assume a referendum's happened, and independence is going to happen, now what will be the process? And they said, well, that's just totally ridiculous. I don't think people are saying that nowadays. And are there people inside main building who are quietly putting in time to consider some of the issues? Oh yeah. Will they talk about it openly? Believe you me, no.
Yes. Can I just take us slightly back, because he did give us, unless I'm mistaken, sort of three somewhat different perspectives on, you know, the threats facing a separate Scotland. Can I just ask you to give us a brief outline of what you thought the appropriate force structure and level and equipment level might be to cope with those levels of threat, just so that we've got the sort of parameters around which the debate can be conducted. Maybe just starting in the same order again.
Well,
sorry, as we indicated earlier on, I've got to be somewhere by 8.
Sure. I was going to say, do you want a 1 minute answer or you want a longer answer? Because in a way, it's still a chicken and egg problem. What are you trying to do? And if you don't know what, I mean, one of the things that concerns me is, and Stuart Crawford, who has done work on this, would say, right, we need, armed forces of roughly 25,000, and it'll be a couple of brigades, one regular, one TA, and those sort of things. And that's all fine, except for what? The for what question actually determines what you're going to do. Now, if you're talking about the sorts of things that Francis just talked about, of course you'd be looking at probably predominantly maritime and air capabilities rather than ground forces. If, on the other hand, pick up something which I think could be a real question for Scotland, which is that you look at civil disorder as possibly involving a military engagement in a way that at the moment the Westminster government certainly does not see it as involving a military engagement, but the sorts of things that Malcolm was referring to, that serious economic problems cause real problems of violence on streets or whatever else, then you might be wanting ground forces to supplement the police in a domestic context. That will put you in a different place again. Do you feel Scotland should be a peacekeeping force, be able to provide a peacekeeping force? Will the consequence of the effects of Iraq and Afghanistan and the elevation at the same time of the responsibility to protect, which create potentially contradictory impulses in foreign policy, but if, assuming Scotland's in the UN, will be a UN obligation, will those two things actually lead to a revival of what sort of old-fashioned peacekeeping, in which case Scotland might well want to see itself as positioned and part of that? Now, so I'm already not giving you the 1 minute answer, but something that says, and I see no reason, for example, to dissent from Stuart Crawford's figures as a departure point, but you will immediately say there are things that aren't there that a force might want. And the big ticket items would be the ones that actually Scotland would need to discuss, which is, would it need fast jets, and if so, how would it get them? What sort of maritime capability would it want? Would it actually want frigates as opposed to simply maritime patrol capabilities? I don't think it would need a carrier simply because it will be able to launch air assets from ground bases. What would it need in the way of armour, if anything? Probably nothing would be one argument, that you might need a light reconnaissance vehicle, but you might not need a tank. Those are the sorts of questions or answers actually, which seem to underpin much of the thinking at the moment, which brings the defence budget pro rata to manageable levels, because you're not investing in a great deal of this heavy equipment, and you're keeping your forces relatively small on the presumption that they are designed predominantly for Scottish defence and possibly for some notional contribution to something like peace.
Is it fair, I mean, before I move along, is it fair for us to take Stuart Crawford's perspective as a sort of, de minimis and then you just add other items off the menu, and then there's a bill, attached to them. I mean, you've got a sort of home guard, and then you've got some planes and some boats, and then the more planes you want, you just add more stuff on. I mean, is that an easy way of looking at it, or does it have to be completely restructured?
Well, I think what he's done is taken what you might call the legacy items and thought, what will we get? What will inherit? What will inherit? I mean, he's come out of the army from an army background himself. He's taken what he's familiar with. What he hasn't done is said, if you've got a new state in this part of the world, what actually would you want from a blank sheet of paper?
It's not going to be a blank sheet of paper, and I think the starting point, which I started on the calculations, was you have a divorce, how are you going to calculate? And it's not going to be a supermarket going along the aisles picking. You are going to end up with a certain amount of kit given to you as part of the breakup of the British Armed Forces.
Well, are you?
Now, what other way will it happen? You will not be able to say, for example, and this is perhaps one of the thorniest ones, despite the anti-nuclear side, the no nuclear propulsion weapons and so forth, directly, Scottish taxpayers have paid for nuclear attack submarines, ballistic missile boats and so forth. They have a stake in those. Therefore, that comes into the mix. You can get into horse trading afterwards and say, well, if I don't want my half of a Steve-class boat, what will you give me for that half of a boat? But the starting point is not going to be a blank sheet of paper. The starting point, you look at the discussion of the infantry battalions and other units, it isn't a blank sheet of paper. It is a sheet of paper with a lot on it. And I think actually the whole issue of force structures, it's not as difficult as you might think. Bearing in mind the number of examples around with Denmark, the Netherlands and so forth, it's pretty easy to look at what these countries can do for a certain amount of money with what kit. It honestly doesn't take that much time. And then work out as an independent Scotland which of those models suits you best. And if you were to ask what the sort of balance is, okay, Ireland, it's not even a gendarmerie. It's a pretty ineffective force that has to rely on everyone else for anything. You have then got very capable Danish naval forces, pretty capable Dutch naval forces, Norwegians now mastering very large air forces. You have got a range of examples sitting there on the shelves with budgets available. I'm not convinced it's that difficult to work out what an independent Scotland would want its armed forces to look like. You have got examples which have then got operational experience all over the world, and you can look at that and go, that looks like the one for us.
Can I just say very quickly that I think one of the questions would be the balance, and these Scandinavian examples highlight this question, the balance between reserves and regulars. And when I was thinking of of what you might want, you might actually go, according to roles to anticipate, in a very different direction in terms of the balance between regular and reserve capabilities. And the Norwegians are a case in point where 25,000 regulars roughly and twice that number of reservists. So it's a very different mix than the mix we currently have.
Could I come back to Francis's point on dividing the assets, because it's a union-wide issue, but it's particularly important in defence. The MOD accounts show the total value after depreciation of MOD assets is about £88 billion. And you could divide these in the event of separation in two ways. You could divide them, as has happened in the Soviet Union, for example, according to where assets happen to be at independence. Some of the assets are rather mobile, so it'd be interesting to see what happened in the days before that. But that would be one principle. So on that principle, of course, all the Royal Navy submarines would be part of the Scottish equation. And then, of course, you'd do some swaps after that. Or you could do it in the principle that population share, that everybody's paid for these assets over decades, so that Scotland should take 8.5% of that 88 billion and then work out what that's equivalent to and do some sort of bartering of that nature. On either of those models, in my view, Scotland would have some assets, but they wouldn't be the right sort of assets for what folk like ourselves, starting from a blank sheet of paper, might say was the model. And one of the differences between an independent Scotland on the one hand and Norway and Denmark on the other is they've had decades to design, to build up forces, to build up skills for their role. I mean, Norway's been an independent state for, I think, more than 100 years, for example. They've had a long period to build up those capabilities, and it wouldn't be an overnight job. So I think thinking about what Scotland would ideally want, well, Scotland won't get to what it ideally decides for another 20 or 30 years in a rapidly changing world. And the last point in relation to the Norway-Denmark comparison is that spending does come into this. And I don't think, unless there's a very big change in the strategic environment, like a war in the Arctic, which I actually don't think is very likely, but it's a possibility, unless there's a big change to the strategic situation, I wouldn't imagine Scotland spending more of its GDP on defence than the NATO average, which is actually around where Norway and Denmark are. I mean, for all Norway and Denmark in the military worry about a range of things, that's what the military paid to do. Norway and Denmark both spend about 1.4% of their GDP on defence. That's not a hallmark of countries which are seriously threatened about having a war with Russia next year. They're involved in prudent preparation, so would Scotland have to be. But if Scotland spent about 1.4% of its GDP in defence, it would have a budget, depending on how you count oil revenues in the GDP, of somewhere between 1.7 and 2.1 billion pounds per annum, which compares with the Norwegian annual defence budget of over 4 billion pounds and a Danish defence budget of almost 3 billion. So Scotland would be spending on that scenario significantly less in defence than Norway and Denmark, though significantly more than Ireland. And it would, in the end, after transition costs are paid, I think get a capability more or less of that order of magnitude. Now, I think Stuart Crawford's model army, which is a very interesting and, as you said, Chair, a helpful starting point. I think given that spending constraint, if you wanted to add anything to his model forces, you'd have to take something else away, otherwise it just wouldn't add up.
Jim, you wanted to come in particular?
Yeah, yes, thanks, Chair. It's just on the point of the regimental structures and the British Armed Forces personnel. I was lucky enough there about an hour ago to ask the Prime Minister a question about this, but very significant in my local area, Dundee and Tayside, is the Black Watch Battalion. Now, I know it's a matter of opinion rather than a matter of fact, but could you see the Black Watch continuing to exist if Scotland separated from the UK?
I think one of the problems, and certainly in terms of a costing and force structure issue, one of the most challenging pledges of keeping all the names, all the battalions and so forth, is you would end up with a Scottish Armed Forces and keep all the bases, everything. Scottish Armed Forces predicated not on what you want to do as a military, but just simply on numbers of personnel. And it would also be a very expensive armed forces just paying people. So would all of those units, look, if an independent Scotland wanted 7 named infantry battalions plus named artillery regiments and armoured regiments, fine. It'll just be a very, very manpower intensive, expensive armed forces which won't necessarily be able to do much. And that is a decision that an independent Scottish government will have to take. At the moment, the Scottish battalions are keeping going. I would just throw in one thing from the point of view of someone who did in my own way serve for 10 years. At the time of the last future army structure, the whole issue of the Scottish regiments did themselves absolutely no favours by trying to claim that they were special and they were elite and things like that. They actually turned the rest of the army off. And so rather than the armed forces fighting the politicians as a unit trying to fight their corner as the military, the view was, well, if you think so little of us, we won't necessarily stand alongside you. And I would just seriously counsel at this time for the Scottish regiments not to try and play that same card, because, and I will get wrong, who was it who said we should stand together or we will surely hang separately. That will apply in spades this time around.
Okay. Right, well, perhaps I should just put on record that I disagree with you entirely.
That's what witnesses are here for. Yeah. So that we can disagree with them.
I think you're going to disagree with me too, but if can I just put a slightly different gloss on this? I mean, the last time round, of course, it was the Black Watch that was absolutely in the front line in terms of resisting the reorganisation of the creation of the Royal Regiment of Scotland, whereas the Argylls, which had been the highlighted regiment in the late 1960s, and of course was reduced to company strength and then brought up to battalion strength again, took the reorganisation on the chin. But the effect, as Francis has said, collectively, of course, is once one Scottish regiment was resisting, then the collective benefits that came from creating a large regiment were essentially jeopardised, because there was not a buying into the working of a large regiment in the way that has happened, for example, with the Rifles, which has been a very successful example of a regiment that has lost individual battalion identities but gained a greater identity as a consequence. For my own money, the Royal Regiment of Scotland has a very clear identity, which is it is Scots. And for most of the Scottish public, that is absolutely what they recognise, particularly in the large conurbations. You know, I think in Glasgow and Edinburgh, much of this is really not fully understood. I quite understand that on Tayside, it's a different story. Just as I live in the Borders, and I have to say, the King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Royal Scots Amalgamation caused feeling, and I understood exactly where people were coming from. But there is a wider problem here, which Francis referred to, and that is the manpower base simply won't sustain this number of Scottish infantry battalions. That has been true since 1881, and one of the reasons why every time there's a reorganisation of the army, and particularly since 1957, but beginning in 1881, that the Scottish regiments have been up front in terms of the issue of their identity and their future, precisely because actually the population base hasn't been there. In 1881, the problem was that there were too few Highlanders to fill the Highland regiments. So they were recruiting in the lowlands, and the lowland regiments then recruited south of the border to make up their numbers. And that has, broadly speaking, been the story from that day to this. And you know, you all know that the Scottish battalions at the moment, in terms of Scottish recruiting, and Scottish recruiting is pretty healthy. I mean, it's not that Scottish recruiting is bad in relation to the rest of the United Kingdom. It's just the Scottish population base is small. The Scottish battalions are kept up to strength by Fijians. You know, essentially, the Royal Regiment of Scotland is sustaining one regular battalion more than it can fill with Scots. And so at some point, this is an issue that has to be grasped. And I think most people thought that in 2004, 5, 6, it had been grasped because the Royal Regiment of Scotland was created precisely to enable the sort of flexibility that a large regiment creates, and particularly, and this leads into the point about whether the Black Watch would go into the new structures, particularly if you're serving. If you're serving and you're an ambitious soldier, you want the career opportunities which a large regiment creates. If you are in a single battalion, the opportunities just narrow right down. And what has happened to the British Armed Forces, particularly in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, is a degree of professionalisation, which means that even people comparatively junior in rank are thinking much more seriously in career terms. You know, the old days of the Cold War, where people spent their time thinking, when can I get to go skiing, how much football can I get in, and so on and so forth. Those have gone, because actually there just isn't time for that in today's army. And the upshot is that what people want if they join the army is a career where there are real promotion prospects, that they're committing themselves to it as a career, and a single battalion won't deliver that. What concerns me, I realise I'm talking too long, so forgive me, but what concerns me in terms of the move to an independent Scotland is that not only would I think Scotland struggle to sustain a reasonable number of infantry battalions, but also I think many Scots, if they possibly could, would vote their feet and go to the army that are actually going to give them the career options and the career openings. You see it already with Irish who serve in the British Army rather than serve in the Irish Army, and it happened before 1707. That's exactly what Scots did. They didn't serve in the Scots Army, they served on the British-English establishment because that's where the opportunities were.
Jim?
Yeah, well, I think both of the speakers have said, in my view, that they dismiss what is called the golden thread of the Black Watch. You know, there's a lot of people in Dundee, and probably in Tayside and Fife, who joined the Black Watch because their father was in the Black Watch and because their grandfather was in the Black Watch, not because they see it as a career opportunity or somewhere to make a good living or get a big salary or whatever. So to say that, to dismiss the name of the Black Watch, I think is quite offensive and quite insulting.
I will not take the insult. All I would say is there is potential insult back that saying that the large battalions, the large regiments, don't have morale, don't have history, and don't also have people joining because their fathers joined and their grandfathers before them. I know quite well the Royal Anglian Regiment, and my cap badge was Queen's Regiment. You have those regimental loyalties. The Fusiliers as well. And this is why I'm suggesting trying to do the Scottish regiments are different from the rest of the British infantry is a very divisive and very dangerous path and does no one any good. And I agree totally with the regimental principle. When you see occasion, I'm sure both of you two also see the one saying, oh, let's just make it all into one cap badge, one beret. I'm totally against that. I have been, in my TA career, trained by Scottish NCOs. I'm well aware of what they've done to me, and all for the good. And so I'm not fighting that side. Some choice language, I can tell you.
Chair, could I just say that in 2006, I visited America as part of the British-American Parliamentary Group, and at that time I met General David Petraeus, who at that time was I think he was the Supreme Commander for the Allied Forces in Iraq at that time, and he seemed to be something of an authority on the Black Watch. He studied the history, and he had said to me that the one thing that the US Army were envious of when it came to the British Armed Forces personnel was the fact that they had regimental names, battalion names, cap badges, etc. So, I mean, I'll repeat what I said earlier. I find it offensive and quite insulting if the witnesses here dismiss that.
Well, look, let's not spend too much time on this. I mean, I do understand the strength of feeling on both sides, but I don't want to focus just on this. What I do want, however, to pick up is what I understood the witnesses to be saying, which was that you believe that a separate Scottish armed forces would not be able to sustain the number of single battalion regiments that they have at the present time. I mean, is that correct?
And also, you would be faced with the probable range of budgets. You have the choice between equipment or manpower. And by the way, that is being faced by almost every European country and the United States at the moment. Manpower is expensive, just is. So if you want large manpower armed forces, then something will give, and the equipment will give, which means those armed forces will do less. And I have to say, I'm very much in agreement from personal experience with totally, I'll agree, unscientific opinion poll, but every time I've lectured at armed forces bases around Britain, and with the subject of independence, and you say, would you stay with the Scottish Defence Force or stay with the British Armed Forces?
Let me come on to that in a minute. We've got that, but I just wanted to be absolutely clear that you're all of the view that separate Scottish Defence Forces would not be able to sustain the existing pattern of regimental battalions. I mean, there would have to be some...
Unless there were a dramatic change in recruiting patterns and the offer was that much greater. I mean, coming back to the Norwegian comparison, Norway, they have conscription, of course, in Norway, but there is competition to be conscripted because it's seen as a good career option, as it is in Switzerland. And of course that could change the situation, but then there's a budgetary question, obviously, if you sustain that number of battalions. And you said single infantry battalions, and I think that is the key question, whether you would feel that actually that's what you wanted, a single infantry regimental regimental structure, or whether you would want a large regiment. And that large regiment, and I actually believe it should have been called the Black Watch. I mean, that's the senior Highland Regiment, but then that would have eclipsed the other one. Let's get off that.
That is somewhat of a diversion as well. I mean, my own experience, certainly the Royal Regiment of Scotland, I mean, the last time I was at, I think it was Selkirk Sevens, which was some time ago, the Royal Regiment of Scotland team was composed entirely of Fijians. I mean, there was not a Scottish accent amongst them. I mean, I think they won the tournament, if I remember correctly, which is presumably the point of the exercise. But look, could I just carry on with some of the point? Can I just come back to the question of division of assets, if I could, because we've got a list of things that we wanted to cover, and I don't think we covered this one adequately. I mean, how would you envisage the division of assets being handled? I mean, you mentioned earlier on, I think, is it a tenth or is it a pick and mix, or you get the equivalent of monopoly money and you can spend this amount, and presumably the assets have also got to be balanced by the debits in a sense, because presumably the relocation costs of Trident and so on, which are potentially going to be enormous, have to be counted against the costs of the assets, and therefore shares of each have got to be paid. I mean, I don't know how any of that will be handled. Perhaps you could enlighten us.
And I certainly don't have a magic prediction machine.
Well, you're here as expert witnesses, so I mean, we expect.
Well, in that case, I'll tell you exactly what will happen. The first thing is it will be put in a wider context. So there are lots of other assets and liabilities. There's North Sea oil, most obviously, which there will have to be a settlement about. In relation to defence specifically, in addition to the actual assets we have now, buildings, infrastructure, equipment, there are, of course, contractual obligations for future equipment. Contracts that have been signed, and somebody will have to take on those contracts, and it won't always be London. There may be some of those contracts which a Scottish government will want to take on. And if there are cancellation costs, then those will have to be borne. So all that will go in the mix, and it just shows you what a complicated process those negotiations for separation will be. The key, I think, will be whether after a referendum, if both sides accept the result, then what judgments both sides make as to what sort of foreign security policy relationships they have with each other. Because if you went into those negotiations in a hostile spirit and saw it as a zero-sum game, then it would be very difficult to reach an agreement. But the bargaining power would undoubtedly be with the UK rather than with Scotland. But I think it's also possible, maybe likely, who knows, it depends on the political atmosphere, that both sides will see they have an interest in compromise because they will continue to inhabit the same island. You can go back to a pre-1707 situation where there's a union of the crowns and a lot of military cooperation, even though they're independent states under the crown, in which the UK doesn't want Scotland to be a base for sub-state threats, for terrorism, for security problems. So Scotland will need to have the UK will need to have strong security forces, security agencies working in Scotland in close cooperation with the security agencies in the UK. They will need access to Scotland. They will need to have arrangements for mutual procurement, not least, and most symbolically, but not the only example, there will be the Trident base. And I think, and I've written about this quite a number of years ago actually, the last time there was a surge in support for independence a decade ago. I think it's, if an independent Scottish government was to insist on the Trident submarines being removed rapidly without the UK government having anywhere to put them, then that would create a very bad atmosphere between Scotland and the UK, and indeed Scotland and the wider international community. They would not understand. It's one thing accepting a redivision of territories, which very few other countries in NATO would sympathise with at all, but it's quite another if it was seen to be taking a radically different foreign policy course, and that's what rapid expulsion would be. But if a Scottish government was to accept that for a significant period of time, perhaps indefinitely, but certainly a long period of time, Trident would have to remain because there simply isn't anywhere else to put it, then that in itself would be a significant bargaining card for Scotland. And Scotland could say, okay, well, we've given you this, but in return we want to have a reasonable negotiation which leaves Scotland with a defence force which is small but does the job, and a Scotland in NATO which therefore doesn't have to rely entirely on itself for its own security.
I think that's a very helpful point. I mean, essentially what you're saying is that issues relating to defence should not be seen in isolation, but they can be balanced by trade-offs elsewhere, such as access to the Bank of England or the use of currency and all the rest of it. Yes, I think. Sorry, Ian, you wanted to follow up the point there in particular.
Just quickly on the assets, would Scotland be able to put a criteria in there that says, for instance, we don't want anything handed over, for instance, a frigate that's over 5 years old or 10 years old? Or would we see that what was handed over may be a mixture, in effect, that we would need to, a separate Scotland, need to replenish that sooner rather than later?
My view is that if you look at the assets that the UK has, that 88 billion or thereabouts, then almost all the high-end assets are assets which Scotland would not want. It won't want any of the submarines, it won't want the Type 45s, it won't want the carriers, just in the Navy.
You've already identified that Scottish people have invested taxes in that.
Yes, so I think it's quite likely that...
So would there be equal a trade-off to say we don't want a submarine but we'll take 2 helicopters?
So this actually, if you are looking at it from the point of view of what is, forget the asset value, let's look at the size of the Air Force. Now when I first wrote this there were Harriers around and Nimrod, so forgive the fact that they've both disappeared from the piece. If you were saying, let's just say for the sake of argument, Scotland's 10% of the economy, let's just say, what does that equate? You end up with, for the sake of argument, that Scotland would be worth 0.3 of an aircraft carrier. Now straight away you say, well, what's the use of having 0.3 of an aircraft carrier? The answer is none. However, that does allow you to say, well, I will swap you my 0.3 in favour of something else I need. If you look through the list as existed at the time, Scotland would be allocated 15 Tornadoes. Is that a useful fleet? Yeah, you can run a fleet of 15 Tornadoes, absolutely. If you were to assume all 232 Typhoon, which might happen now, Scotland would have got 23. Is that a usable fleet? Absolutely. And you could have gone down through there and looked at which fleets were viable, and be of armoured vehicles, planes, ships, and which ones weren't. Under this sort of calculation, Scotland would have been allocated 1 3/4 Type 23 frigates. Again, the value of 3/4 of a ship, especially if it's missing the front bit, may not be perfect, but that is when you sit down, coming back to the one of negotiating in good faith, you say, okay, if you're going to give me both ships, what do you want in return? It is doable, but I would agree entirely, if both sides come at it like that, that wouldn't be nice. However, I think we should bear in mind there are international bodies for negotiations. In Geneva, just give one example, the 3 corvettes originally ordered by Brunei, which were tied up on the Clyde for how many years?
Yep.
That went to the International Court of Settlements in Geneva, who did actually find in favour of the UK and BA systems rather than Brunei. So I think we should bear in mind that this type of process, there is a higher body you can go to and say, we feel this, they feel that, what do you think? And so there will be a referee if you wanted
Lindsay,
it.
you wanted to...
So are you saying, even with the best of goodwill, it would hardly be strategic?
To...
In terms of the strategic approach to defence of Scotland?
Well, I mean, coming from Francis's way of describing it, I think it's very useful as a template of one possible way to do it. And how it would actually happen in practice, I really do not know. But if a Scottish government in such a scenario were to be strategic, then it would look at all the sort of calculations Francis has done in relation to how many tornadoes Scotland would be entitled to and so on, and then say, well, could we afford to maintain those tornadoes? Could we afford to train their personnel? Because a lot of these high value assets, the running costs are much bigger than the capital costs.
But that's a best case scenario.
And therefore they might then decide, well, actually, we don't want to get into that. We prefer to have maybe some Hawk jets rather than tornadoes, for example. Something which is more affordable to run, even if it's not top of the range. And I think my guesstimate would be at the end of that process, given the sort of levels of recurrent expenditure Scotland could expect to have in defence, they would end up wanting less than their proportion of the total defence assets. So they'd want 5% rather than 10% of the total. But they might want to trade that for something else.
My understanding of your question was different. That is that horse trading over equipment would take the place of a serious long-term outlook as to what Scotland's defence and international position
and that would be
a
best case scenario if there was goodwill.
Well, I think the crucial question is the length of time that this would be done over, because it seems to me, as things currently stand, on day one, if Scotland were independent, it would probably not have a fully fledged defence and foreign policy, just because it would still be learning those skills, and it would still be uncertain of its position in the world, and it wouldn't know what its relationships were likely to be with the EU, with NATO, or even with the UN. I mean, the UN will be obviously be a member, presumably.
Thank you.
But there's a consequence. If it went on, over the 10 years, if it took, say, that length of time to complete the process of divvying up who got what, I don't think it would take that long, then of course concurrently it will be possible for some sort of strategic assessment and strategic understanding to develop.
Yeah.
But you will be beginning in the Edinburgh context, it seems to me, from a low base point, because essentially such strategic thinking as goes on in the United Kingdom, naturally enough, happens more here than there, here in London.
But surely, I mean, surely that's not acceptable when people are going to be asked to vote on whether or not they want to have a separate Scotland. The idea that they would get separation and then work out what they wanted to do in terms of foreign and defence policy is just simply, I mean, that really is, treating the people of Scotland with contempt, asking them to buy a pig in a poke.
Well, that's what I mean. I would agree entirely with you, but that's exactly why the debate needs to happen now, and why these issues need to be addressed.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, of course, the focus has come in more on defence than it has on foreign policy. Because, of course, defence industry, and because it's so central to this, and because there are assets at stake. But actually, if you're going to answer your strategic question, you must have some idea of foreign policy. The NATO question, dare I come back to it, but it's a key issue for the SNP, as we know, because it potentially divides the party. But that issue is central to answering the question about strategy.
Right. I mean, I think it very much seems to us that some of these things ought to be known or knowable, well, knowable certainly, and ought to be made available to us now. And then the grey areas, as it were, get filled in as we proceed. Because I can see no reason why both sides should not be able to lay out their negotiating position on what assets they want, because it's clear what posture they want to achieve well before people are actually asked to vote. Does that seem unreasonable?
No, absolutely fine. And I would come back to the point of saying, what should Scottish defence look like in independent Scotland? There are more than enough examples in comparative European states that it wouldn't necessarily be that suddenly Scotland reverts to speaking Danish or anything, but you look at the various models they have ended up with. I don't see any need for anyone to have to go through hundreds of years of history to end up with a shape, when they can look at a country like Denmark or the Netherlands or Norway and see what they are trying to do, and you get a very nice blueprint from where you move.
Which I think, it seems a little bit of this debate is artificial, because the point is that there would be a transition of 2 decades or something, because if there wasn't a transition of 2 decades, then one of the things that you see is that Scotland is over-provisioned with infantry battalions for any strategic analysis that they might do. You're saying that the problems are in the Arctic, you don't need infantry battalions for that, and independence would just trigger the fact that had to be cut, hugely potentially, and therefore that probably wouldn't be sensible from either side in the dialogue. It just seems to me that there would be a 2-decade transition of this sort of thing. And I agree with the chairman saying it's a pig in the poke, but it's a little bit harsh in this case. And I suppose what I was thinking is, couldn't you do a lot of it with, governance arrangements at the top of how the Army and the Air Force and the Navy were structured on your way to that significant transition, albeit with an independent Scotland?
Just in terms of the timings, bearing in mind even though it's talked about as Future Force Structure 2020, that most of the key moves are happening in 6 years, I'm not sure it would take 20 years to come to a future structure, except if you're regarding large capital equipment.
For example, you've raised a point which seems to me to be very coherent, that for 100 years Scotland has provided an overly significant part of the British Army's infantry. That's just a historical thing. That's sort of been half addressed over the years, but actually independence potentially could force it to a head, because they would say, well, either they're going to use all of those infantry, or they're going to have to, and therefore pay for them, or bring it to a head. And all I'm saying is, in the reality, there would be some kind of quite long transition. It seems to me that would be sensible for everybody, even in the case of independence.
Is it not going to be a long transition if it were to happen just because legally it'll take a long time to sort all this through? I mean, I hear different estimates, but, Malcolm and I were both at the Conference on Defence the Scotsman organised last week, and people were talking about the possibility of this transition being a couple of years. But I've heard other people say it could be 10 years. I haven't necessarily heard 20 years. Just because it would take that long to unscramble legislation which has effectively been drafted on the presumption of the existence of the Union. So to create disunion itself would be enormously complicated. And this seems to me to have pretty important implications for the armed forces, because if anything embodies what a state is and lies at the heart of the identification of a state, it is the armed forces and the capacity to defend. Issues of citizenship, if you are already an existing member of the armed forces but have a home in Scotland, of the British Armed Forces but have a home in Scotland, which way are you going to go in terms of your choices? Which way might you be obliged to go because of where you hold your citizenship? These, it seems to me, issues that would only be resolved after the decision had actually been taken. Although I agree entirely that this is logically, I would want to know before I go and cast my vote in any referendum what the implications were. But my understanding of where we are is it's much more likely to be the other way around. The issue would be addressed in principle, and then the ramifications.
Well, can I just pick up this point? I mean, because you were having a discussion about transition, and I mean, I think, in a sense, spending too much time on the transition, to some extent, misses the point. I mean, I can see no reason why, before a referendum vote, a Scottish party or organisation seeking separation should not be able to spell out where it wants to be. That's a menu then that is laid before the Scottish public. The question then of how that is achieved and how long it takes and the process of haggling and stuff like that, I mean, these are issues to some extent of implementation, but you don't get the decision and then you start haggling and then you work out where you are at the end, and that's where you pretend that's where you want it to be. I mean, I can see no reason why, strategic pattern, such as whether or not you want to be like Ireland or Norway, whether or not, I mean, I think it was your point about the Arctic. I mean, all of these points surely could be done almost within the next couple of weeks in a broad sweep term, and then you're filling in more of the detail, and then there's the decision in principle, and then there's the question of transition. Surely that is the way that this should be handled.
The historian in me says that is how it should be, but in practice it rarely has been. The historian in me says that you would love to have a strategy that is clear, addressing exactly the question of what a strategy should be, with sort of means, ways and ends all clearly spelled out. But the reality is, particularly I think in the democratic process, is that it is much more confused than that. And what emerges, you hope is guided by that sort of overall objective, and I think it's absolutely right to try and impose that. But what emerges does tend to be an interaction between that overall objective and the haggling that we've been talking about in terms of what...
I mean, you're not saying that the SNP are confused, surely?
Surely not.
Surely they must have a clear idea. I mean, they either are completely confused and have no idea, or they do know fine and they're just not telling us.
I don't think they've... Well, my impression is they really haven't seriously addressed this.
And there's nothing published which gives any significant lead, issues about what would be the size of a budget and so forth. It is an absolute vacuum, which is why you have to come up with a table with, if it's 1.1% of, then this, and it's a range of options. You can get some ideas, and you can then argue about them forever. Someone who talks about a Scottish self-defence force, I have to say I'm not really sure is even going to be spending 1.4% of GDP on defence, will not want to be sending much more than a couple of observers on UN missions, and most of the forces will stay within the 12-mile limit.
But this gets worse, because you're now describing the separatist defence and foreign policy as a complete vacuum. Now, this is not reassuring to me as a Scot.
Well, unless I've been getting very strange copies of the SNP manifestos of the last few elections or have missed something, the number of concrete statements on defence which allow you to go, okay, that means X. Well, actually, one of the few ones is, in recent years, it's been, would not join NATO, which again, I have to say, gives you a pretty firm idea of what direction such a policy would take you.
To be fair, I think that's this week. That might not be...
I don't know. I've actually always tried to stay out of the politics when doing this analysis by saying, if Scotland wants independence, that is, I live in London, British, it's nothing to do with me, and I will wish them well. And so I've tried to keep out of the politics and look at it just from the point of view of the horse trading which would result. And I've actually started thinking it was going to cost an absolute fortune to sort out, and discovered it probably wouldn't. And it could be far easier to sort out. And I'd be wholly in agreement with you. I think a lot of these things should be put forward as options so people know what the options are. And I know later on we're meant to be getting on the industrial side,
yes,
and that is going to be a very interesting one because it isn't very rosy.
Could I follow that to say that if you look at experience within the UK and the extent to which what political parties say before elections about defence is reflected in what they do in defence reviews after the election, there's not always a lot of clarity there. And it's understandable, as an analyst, it's understandable why politicians don't want to put hard choices before the public when they come to elections, even within a country with a relatively stable situation. It's more understandable, I think, facing with all the uncertainty one has approaching a referendum. So I mean, I don't anticipate any political party before the referendum coming out with details of exactly what defence forces Scotland have. What I think is reasonable, and it really underlines what Francis is saying, it is reasonable, I think, when sketching out what Scottish independence would mean, to talk about the broader issues, such as whether Scotland would be a member of the European Union or NATO, or the conditions it would have to fulfil to do that at a broad level. But to try to predict how many frigates or armoured combat vehicles or attack aircraft an independent Scotland would have, I mean, this is not the sort of thing actually you should decide until you have access to an awful lot more information.
Additional point here, because actually the SNP have got no mandate for defence or foreign affairs, so actually they don't speak for Scotland on it, because therefore there really has to be a general election in Scotland on separation, in which case you have political parties coming forward, one of whom, and therefore coming out of that would be somebody who has got a mandate to create a foreign policy. It seems to me that, you know, I don't want to defend the SNP.
I think it seems the view from Warrington is very interesting in that context. But I think for those of us that will be faced with having to vote in a referendum, I mean, the idea that these decisions will be taken afterwards is just simply not adequate. And, you know, going into a referendum with, on the one hand, confusion, and on the other hand, complete vacuum. I'm not quite sure which is worse, but I mean, it's just simply not acceptable. And I think we'll reflect. I think we've got a fairly good grasp of your understanding of the SNP's defence policy at the moment. So maybe if we could just move on slightly. Now, Ian, you were going to pick up on question 3 points about the membership of the forces.
Yeah, it was just, and I think we touched on it briefly when we discussed some of the Scottish regiments and the personnel there. And it's just that separation. What would be the effects in separation of Scots serving in the UK armed forces and also those wishing to serve in the UK armed forces in the future?
Well, at the moment, of course, you swear an oath of loyalty to Her Majesty, her heirs and successors. I would have imagined that if you're a Scot, the successor state is Scotland, and that actually isn't necessarily an insuperable problem, not least because, of course, under the SNP's current position, that the Queen will remain head of state in Scotland. So that I don't see a massive problem there. I think the much bigger question is if you are somebody in mid-career, let's say a colonel in the army or a senior warrant officer or that sort of level, or a sergeant, NCO, and you have got a fair degree of pension entitlement, reasonable career prospects, you have done the hard graft of your military service, which way would you go? And I think, if I dare mention the Black Watch again, if the Black Watch were going to Scotland, would you feel I will go with the Black Watch because I love the regiment? And I'm not saying for a moment that that those who serve in the Black Watch don't love the regiment, or those who serve in Three Scots don't love the regiment, and they would feel torn, and particularly if they had served in it for a long time, they might feel that. Or do they stay in a career stream which they understand, which has further career opportunities, and is a known beast? It will change, of course, there will be an issue. Now, you might say this is a transitional problem, that once a Scottish army is up and running, or Scottish Defence Force is up and running, and it's clearly separate and independent from the rest of the UK, that there is a different career option. And I think that's absolutely true. You're a young man or woman in Scotland in 20 years after independence, and you decide to join the armed forces. It may well be that at that point you take a totally open decision and you say, I'm a Scot, therefore I served in the Scottish Defence Force. Except if there is a hangover, if there are Scots who continue to pursue careers in the rest of the UK's armed forces immediately after independence, I suspect that trend may continue if it is legally possible to do so. And as I say, it is legally possible at the moment from the point of view of the United Kingdom, from the point of view of London. So unless Scotland were to make it impossible, I would have thought that that would continue. And I think there are real issues. And it goes on to, we tend always to see, Stuart Crawford's analysis and the way we've thought about it, we tend to think of this in terms of assets and small units. But the collective capabilities which the UK Armed Forces have, I'm thinking now of the Defence Academy, the individual service establishments in terms of training and education, above all intelligence, where would Scotland have those? Would they be buying into the rest of the UK's? And if they were buying into the rest of the UK's, that would be another reason for people being pulled away from Scotland towards London in terms of where they might want to be. It might well be, of course, that the independent Scotland would negotiate an intelligence arrangement if they could, more difficult, but certainly negotiate places at the Defence Academy, at Sandhurst, Cranwell, Dartmouth and so on. And my guess is that that is actually what would happen.
I think one thing in terms of the legal side of what happens afterwards, you should remember that Irish citizens are still recruited into the Irish Guards and other parts of the British Army. So whatever the legal arrangement was in 1921 to still allow them, and I don't know, but I'm assuming they do swear an oath of allegiance to Her Majesty, heirs and successors, those that wish to do it, do it. So in the nicest sense, I think that's probably one of the easiest things.
Yes.
Dust off the legislation from 1921, delete the word Irish into the word Scottish, and it should be doable.
Malcolm.
Is it also fair to say that the Irish regiments that you refer to, they were only founded in 1921, or since 1921?
Well, Irish Guards was 16, wasn't it? Or 15, but the Rangers.
The Irish regiments recruited in what is now the Republic were disbanded in 1921. That was a direct consequence. So the Connaught Rangers, all those regiments went. Those that recruited in the north, or sufficiently in the north, so the Royalists and the Fusiliers, for example, remained on the British establishment. And the Irish Guards, indeed, you're absolutely right, was created during the course of the First World War, particularly a pregnant moment, obviously, from the point of view of Ireland, literally, but they could justify being retained on the British establishment precisely because of Northern Ireland, but it didn't mean they didn't recruit from south of the border.
Yeah. And the Irish Guards has got a very heavy sum.
So possibly the Scottish regiments, battalions, Black Watch, etc., would be disbanded and possibly reformed under a different name, or
I wouldn't see disbandment. I think you would see, regiments marching proudly from one place to another. I don't think you'd have disbandment parades.
Yes, there's a difference between units, where presumably Scottish units would be retained in Scotland in some way, but the question of individuals is perhaps more significant from the point of view. And I think, as I understand it, if you're saying that basically if Fijians can join the British forces and Scottish regiments, then Scots would be able to join English forces, and probably vice versa as well. And that should not pose a difficulty. What for future, but what I'm not clear about from what you're saying is what would happen to those who are there at the moment. Would they be given an option? Say if you're an Englishman in the Royal Regiment of Scotland somewhere, or a Scot, indeed in a Scottish regiment based down in England, or you're a Scot in the Royal Anglian, whatever it is. No disrespect. I mean, would these people then be chosen? And what then happens if you don't actually have a mix? If they say, well, look, we'll fill up a rifleman, or we don't need any tank crews anymore. Have you any idea of how this has ever been handled before, or how it might be handled?
Well, I mean, this may be something your committee is doing a separate inquiry on, but to answer your question, you first of all have to say what the hypothesis is on how citizenship is determined. Because right now, as I understand it, those entitled to vote in the referendum are those on the electoral roll at the time of the referendum. Now, if that is a principle on which future citizenship is decided, then there are many English-born people serving with the armed forces in Scotland, and vice versa. Indeed, there are many on the crews of submarines based at Fastlane who are entitled to vote in the Scottish referendum. Will they be Scottish citizens after independence? Will it depend on where their mothers or fathers or grandfathers were born? Will people be entitled to be English citizens and Scottish citizens and UK citizens at the same time. So it's possible, if dual citizenship is allowed and people can move to an armed force job in England, they automatically, by joining the electoral roll in East Anglia, they automatically become a UK citizen. Then this issue is moot. If, however, it's decided to separate out the citizenship in some way, so that people like myself who live in England but were born in Scotland have to choose which country to be a citizen, or maybe we won't have a choice, then you're in quite a different, and I think a much more confrontational position. So in a sense, I think this is more, it's not so much a defence issue, it's an issue about how you sort out citizenship if there were to be separation.
Yes. Even then, I have some dealings with the New Zealand Defence Force. And some of those serving the New Zealand Defence Force, there's an interesting interplay here between that and the British Armed Forces, which really overrides the issue of citizenship. So you will find New Zealanders who, of course, can't fly fast jets in New Zealand anymore, who want to join the Royal Air Force precisely so they can. They more frequently join the Royal Australian Air Force because it's a bit closer, but they've certainly served in the Royal Air Force in the past. And you will also find those who later in their career decide actually they want to emigrate and go to New Zealand and like a slightly quieter life, who will then join the New Zealand Defence Force and go the other way. So there are people who've done maybe 10, 15 years of pretty active soldiering, pretty active service, and then decide that actually they will move to New Zealand but remain in the armed forces. And that move, either way, seems to be accomplished remarkably easily, whether it's his membership of the Commonwealth, and in fact the Queen is head of state that provides that common identity that enables that. But interestingly, it doesn't seem to hinge too much on the issue of citizenship. But it's precisely that sort of relationship which I think all of us in some form or another can see happening, a great deal of fluidity actually, rather than a hard division in terms of individuals, which suggests that individual choice will actually be the key thing, much more than what is decided in terms of citizenship.
But the issue presumably in relation to New Zealand, both ways, I mean that to some extent is a trickle.
Yeah.
You know, because you have two situations in stasis, as it were.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're going to have here is potentially the equivalent of Big Bang, where people will have the opportunity to make their choice. I mean, this has been raised with us in the context of should people who will be eligible to join the Scottish forces because they're in the UK forces and potentially die for Scotland, should they be able to vote? In these circumstances in the Scottish election, and you know, I think we're going to have at some point witnesses to saying that basically they should. I mean, I wonder whether or not that's an issue that has occurred to you or has come across your desk at any point.
Well, I've looked at this as a historian, because in the First World War, for example, possibly the majority of those who served in the British Army in the First World War did not have the vote. We didn't have a sense of citizenship being related to military service, because there's no universal manhood suffrage until 1918. And even if you were likely to be eligible for the vote, if you were under 21, of course, you didn't have the vote either. So you went to the front without citizenship in many cases, and you might have died without citizenship. So we don't in this country, and I mean the United Kingdom as a whole, have a strong sense, as you would have, say, in France, that military service and citizenship hang together. We haven't inherited that, partly because I think we haven't had conscription. So it doesn't automatically enter the political debate in the way in which I think it does in other countries. I think it should enter the debate in this case, but I think it will be a novel element in terms of how Britain conducts those discussions, because it has tended to divorce these two things. And of course, the point we've already been making about Fijians, winning sevens at Selkirk, really makes the point exactly, that those aren't citizens, and yet they're serving in the British Armed Forces. They can become eligible for citizenship by virtue of residence. There is a real issue, an ongoing issue with their families and their eligibility for citizenship, because they have to qualify through residence like any other immigrant, which itself can be difficult because battalions are then moved to Germany and so on and so forth. So we really haven't digested a relationship between military service and citizenship here, and I think the question, I suppose, for an independent Scotland was, would you begin with military service as a concept which entitles you to citizenship, or would you begin with the issue of citizenship and say from that our armed forces will be recruited, or might be outside that, and therefore we're really not aligning citizenship and military service?
Right. Either you want to add anything to that? Now, we had some questions here going on to 4 about Scotland spending the same proportion of its GDP, but I think we've pretty well covered most of that, haven't we, in 4 and 5, yes. Yes, I mean, Pamela, number 5, the bit about the deploying the forces overseas, I think.
Gentlemen, in the written evidence that we've had, and Professor Chalmers, you spoke about what percentage of GDP might be most likely. With that in mind, I mean, what is your vision of what a future military of Scotland would look like after all the toing and froing and the deals have been done, with the GDP that we would predict would be spent? What do you think it would look like?
Well, I've tried to lay that out in more detail in a paper I wrote for RUSI, and it's hard to predict, and I think quite a lot will depend on the threat perception of an independent Scotland. So in a sense, all one is going on is what one senses is the political culture in Scotland, not only in the SNP, but across the political elite in terms of what role Scotland might have. And the key point here is the UK is unusual in how high a proportion of its GDP it spends on defence compared with other NATO European countries. And the reason for that is the UK is more ambitious. It's on the Security Council. It wants to be the US is number 2, if you like, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and the Balkans and so on. And that costs money. It's difficult for me to imagine, I mean, anything is possible, it's difficult for me to imagine, given the very difficult economic circumstances an independent Scotland would face, especially in the transition, but perhaps also longer term, that they'd be prepared to give defence as high a relative priority as the rest of the UK. There's a lot of discussion about how Ireland, Norway and Denmark are models, or Sweden sometimes, and you can look at how much they spend on defence. Now, it's possible that an independent Scotland, looking at how difficult transition would be, to adopt basically an Irish option, that basically almost all the options would go to the UK, all the assets would go to the UK, because basically the UK's need for defence assets would not be substantially changed by Scottish independence. Yeah. They wouldn't suddenly wake up after independence and say, well, actually, we no longer need that because we only needed that because Scotland was part of the Union, because there's not really very much the UK devotes, which is only for the purposes of Scotland. And the assets they deploy, the UK deploys in Scotland, for example, at Fastlane, and Fastlane most obviously, all of those will still be required by the UK. But that's also true of air defence assets and so on, to a very significant, maybe not a total extent, very significant extent. So they would want almost everything. And how hard would the Scottish negotiation team ask for that? So
that's a really interesting point. Can I just ask you to look at that in a different way? You're saying that the UK without Scotland would still have very similar requirements.
Yes.
What we're hearing from the Scottish Government is they don't think they will, but I mean, what would be the difference in defence requirements for a Scotland separate from the UK as to what Scotland has at the moment within the UK?
Well, I think on the assumption, and it's perhaps a big assumption, but I think not an unrealistic one, that an independent Scotland would, after all the argy-bargy, end up as a member of the EU and a member of NATO, like Norway and Denmark. And it had to think about what...
Sorry, you think Scotland will end up as a member of NATO?
I think it will. I think it will. Because I think it would be such a radical step after a divisive referendum to then, on top of that, say, we're going to pull out of NATO, having been in NATO.
But surely we have to know that now.
It's a longer period.
We have to know that now before that. I mean, surely that's not a decision that can be left until after the referendum.
But to be fair, I think SNP have said now, have they not? That
No, they haven't. No. But I mean, sorry, it was just your. I mean, you seem to be suggesting to me there that they would have the referendum and then they would decide. Now that seems to me to be absurd.
It wasn't myself that designed the system.
No, but you're in front of us. You're the witness. So
I'm saying, as a matter of observation and analysis, for Scotland to become independent, to be the first advanced industrialised democracy to break apart since World War II, and Quebec almost was there, but it wasn't in the end, would be a radical enough step in a Europe which is itself in a pretty unstable place. So if for a Scottish government in that scenario, and it may well be that all the parties before the referendum are agreed that Scotland should stay in NATO, in which case it won't be an issue. But if they disagree in advance of a referendum, then even in that scenario, I think it would be, and as I think one of the other witnesses said, at some stage there would have to be an election after a referendum. I think the pressure on an independent Scotland to maintain a role in NATO would be pretty substantial. And indeed, some of the countries which are not in NATO in Europe, like Sweden, have very close relationships with NATO, and their foreign policy is constrained by the need to keep good relations with the United States and with their European neighbours and with the NATO bureaucracy. So we'd have to sketch out exactly what the scenario is.
To come back to your original question, what we think it would be reasonable to suspect independent Scottish forces look like. And again, basing on the really quite sparse policy statements in manifestos, talking about defence of airspace, defence of economic zones and so forth, if that is what the defence structure, the policy was, that does lead you pretty inevitably towards a maritime and air-based armed forces with much smaller land forces. The fact that at the same time the issue of could the land forces actually be provided with the troops, let alone then equipped, and again, as soon as you say a Scotland not in NATO, that means you are ruling out any significant deployment of troops overseas, in which case I think taxpayers in an independent Scotland after 5 years would be saying, why have we got all these barracks and units when they don't seem to go anywhere? So if you were to ask me straight away, within 5-10 years after independence, what would a Scottish Defence Force look like? It would be a naval arm, there would be an air arm with not much in the way of fast jets, and a smaller 2-brigade army.
Sorry, just the reason why I was making those remarks about the broader context is because it's hard to answer the question about structure without them. On the assumption that Scotland was in a military alliance, then our Scotland's security would be most of all determined by the need to keep the rest of the alliance happy, to ensure that they came to our aid when it was necessary, and that would require a rather different force structure from one which was self-reliant. And it may well be that if there's a future Afghanistan type operation, then like every other member of NATO right now, Scotland would be expected to send its small contingent to such an operation.
Lindsay, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, the First Minister's on record as saying that if Scotland becomes independent, it would not be the home to nuclear weapons. Is that stance compatible with staying within NATO?
Can I just pick up two other capabilities and then answer that question? I think the other two things an independent Scotland would need to think about is what was this doing about its intelligence, particularly if it's thinking about maritime air capabilities. How much horizon scanning is it doing? Where's the intelligence going to come from that will enable it to do its own defence? And in part related to that, if it only has limited ground forces, and I think even 2 brigades might be big in that sort of structure, unless they were very heavily weighted towards reservists, would it still need special forces, particularly for counter-terrorism operations and those sort of things? On the nuclear issue, the SNP's made the point, or it has been part historically the SNP's position, that Scotland cannot be part of NATO because NATO is an alliance that rests on the principle of nuclear deterrence. Well, there are other countries in NATO which similarly have rejected nuclear weapons, but still see that as compatible with being a member of NATO. And Norway, whom we've referred to regularly in this discussion, is a classic illustration of that. So, but of course Norway will not allow nuclear weapons on Norwegian territory, but will be within NATO, or is within NATO. I mean, that's its position. So that's its solution to the problem. There are other countries that have nuclear weapons based within them, but of course do not themselves own nuclear weapons, which is another position you could take. So there doesn't have to be this close relationship that the SNP has drawn. And I would go one stage further and say it's an arguable point, but I would say that extended deterrence is something that a lot of states, including states outside the NATO structure, can be argued to have benefited from. I mean, this is not an argument we are currently having in the United Kingdom, but during the years of the Cold War, that was the presumption that had emerged, that essentially there was a stability in the international system, a degree of international security which was provided by American extended deterrence, which meant that even if you weren't necessarily within NATO or a fully paid up member of the alliance, and therefore paying your dues, if you like, to the United States, you were still deriving benefit from the United States. And you can see evidence for that, for example, in Australia's position. Australia, quite openly in its last Defence White Paper, acknowledged the benefit that it derived from the United States extended deterrence in terms of the stability it provided within the wider region within which Australia found itself. All I'm really saying in relation to the SNP and to Scotland's position is that actually the SNP has put itself in a more dogmatic position in relation to nuclear weapons than logically it needs to be, given the fact that this issue can be functioned in a number of different ways. And of course the reason it's done that is precisely because of Faslane, because nuclear weapons are actually based in Scotland.
And there would be a dependence on the nuclear umbrella.
Well, we would still, an independent Scotland that rejected nuclear weapons might still get a benefit from a nuclear umbrella without having to have a hand on the umbrella.
Yes, we usually think of fingers on triggers rather than hands on umbrellas, but we get the metaphor.
Is it called a freebie?
Yes, it's free riding, basically, isn't it?
Exactly.
Excuse me, Chair.
Sorry, can I just say that my colleague Jim McGovern and now Lindsay have to leave because there's a debate in Parliament, Westminster Hall, about the regiments actually at 4 o'clock, and Jim was warming up his arguments earlier on, which he will now deploy.
And keeping my powder dry.
Yes. Right. So you wanted to come in, Mark?
I did, yes. I mean, I think Hugh's absolutely right that there's no necessary correlation between nuclear basing and NATO membership. And I think the German example today is a rather interesting one, because the German government, after its last election in its coalition agreement, agreed they wanted nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons, to be removed from Germany. But the key thing in German government policy since that statement has been that they've made it clear they only want this to be achieved through negotiation with other NATO members. They're not saying these will go no matter what anybody else thinks. And these are weapons which are of pretty marginal operational value. Their role is almost entirely symbolic nowadays, the American tactical nuclear weapons in Germany. But even the Germans are saying we will not do this anything unilaterally. And I think the parallel with Scotland is that one can envisage a situation in which the Scottish government said we don't want these things in our territory, we want a different NATO policy, one much less reliant on nuclear weapons. But for Scotland simply but in the particular circumstances of Trident bases in Scotland, there is no way in which the UK government could rapidly rebase these forces in England, and arguably, and I've written at length on this, arguably it would be politically impossible for them to do so. So for Scotland in those circumstances to insist on them leaving would be to force the UK to make a decision to effectively denuclearise, and therefore I think and other NATO member states would look at this process and say, what is this all about? What is Scotland trying to do? The many expatriate Scots in Canada and Australia and the United States who might have some degree of nationalism with a small n at least might say, what is our old country up to here, disrupting long-standing alliances? So I'm cautious about predictions, but I certainly think that if Scotland went to a reasonable fair wind after independence, it would have to find some way of ensuring that this base was not removed until the rest of the UK had a reasonable amount of time to consider alternative basing arrangements. And it might be there weren't ones. I think on the issue of the nuclear umbrella, well, nuclear umbrella is one of these metaphysical concepts which can mean something to anybody. And my suspicion is, like the Norwegians, once the Scottish government were established, it would have sufficiently skilled diplomats that they were able to construct communiques and footnotes to communiques to fudge that issue. I think the real issue, the really difficult issue to resolve is precisely the Trident basing issue.
I'd just like to comment. I have to say one of the increasingly the biggest red herrings is that Trident couldn't be moved from Scotland, and it has just become an article of faith, which, if you actually even bother looking, suddenly where would we store the nuclear warheads? Actually, very easy. All the Marston and Burfield have got spare storage capability. They have full nuclear licenses. One of the ones, of course, Coalport, is sized for a deterrent with 5, 6... Sorry?
Why are they not there at the moment?
The ones in Burfield would require about 50 million of modernisation. But the thing of there is nowhere we could store the warheads is just simply not true. Is it ideal to have them in the middle of Berkshire when your submarines might be based down in Devonport and whatever? No, not ideal. Doesn't mean you can't do it. And you have to remember, all the nuclear warheads go through those facilities for upgrade, maintenance. They're driven along the roads. It happens daily. Are there submarine facilities in Devonport? Barrow, it's got ship lift. You can do refuelling there. You can do missile reloading if you want to do at Barrow. So actually, the facility at Faslane is duplicated by Barrow, so you don't require Faslane for any of the major operations submarine fleet. Do remember, we keep our ballistic missiles in a stockpile in Charles Bay, Georgetown, out in Georgia in the States. So, you know, the idea there are no options, I'm afraid, is utter red herring. Would people be able to move in one day everything elsewhere? No, not in one day. But actually there are more than enough nuclear facilities all around the remaining parts of the UK. There are harbour facilities as well. The Royal Navy actually has been relatively active surveying Milford Haven. It's got a wonderful deep channel. It's still got a Royal Navy quay there. You are actually just off the Celtic Deeps, one of the deepest water channels off the British Isles. Excellent for submarine operations. Plymouth, I can sort of slightly understand. They don't like the idea of the ballistic missile boats going in and out. So it's very shallow for about 25, 30 miles. Strange they still have been operating nuclear submarines out of there for many decades. I would like to believe someone is not actually advertising most of this because they want to keep their cards close to their chest. But the number of options for moving the deterrent out of Scotland are huge. And a lot of them are not that expensive either. You know, I've seen the ones that would cost 50 billion to move. No, it wouldn't. It really wouldn't. And by the way, the figures for renovating Burfield and Aldermaston were done with people who've recently worked there. With the downsizing of the deterrent from 500-600 warheads to under 200, the level of facilities you need, you don't need a Coalport-sized facility. And anyway, over a third of your warheads are going to be at sea the whole time. So, this is one of those ones where, quite frankly, if the SNP is working on we have this great card, it will just be too expensive to move to deterrent. I think they're in for a real shock. And the other ones which had been discussed recently, is there any reason why we shouldn't be able to store warheads in French facilities off Brest? Well, we shared American storage facilities for nuclear warheads in Iserlohn for 40 years, and no one seemed to care. I did spend some time there as well, and you had American guards, you had German guards, British guards. The UK had British bunkers on German soil, but it was a US sovereign base. Don't notice anyone cared one way or the other.
Can I just go back to my original question, which was about half an hour ago now? apart from nuclear, which is, I accept, a big part of what we have in Scotland in the current military, I mean, how different do you think that the Scottish military would look in an independent Scotland in comparison to what is planned under the current spending review? The Armed Forces Review.
The current spending review doesn't plan for a Scottish Armed Force, so it's something you're talking about.
Yes, but but Scotland's a bit part of the UK within the review, is what I'm saying. What we have in Scotland at the moment and what would be planned under the review,
I think it would be utterly different. It would be utterly different.
Yeah. And in that case, then, do you think there'd be less armed forces in Scotland? Then we would have a downsized.
Well, I think the armed forces in Scotland, controlled by Scotland, would be very different because certainly in the naval side, but to some extent perhaps on the Air Force side, there are assets in Scotland which I think it's unlikely that Scotland would want to inherit.
I suppose what I'm getting at is, would Scotland be more vulnerable to attack with the military that we are currently trying to guess at and trying to envisage in a Scotland separate from the rest of the United Kingdom than it is at the moment?
That would depend partly on whether we were in alliance with other countries.
Surely it would also depend on the position of a future Scottish government.
Yeah,
there's nothing to stop a future Scottish government spending 20% of its GDP on defence. So, I mean, it depends who Scotland elects, presumably.
It does.
After a general election that will have to happen.
I think it also comes back to the intelligence question. Vulnerability to, I'm sorry to say this again, but vulnerability to attack includes both the capability of defending, but also the capability to anticipate to some degree. And at the moment, the United Kingdom benefits from an incredibly close relationship with the United States, at least benefits most of the time from that relationship. And there is no presumption that Scotland would. On the other hand, of course, the rest of the United Kingdom would want a close intelligence relationship with Scotland, I would imagine, precisely because the security of the rest of the United Kingdom would also be integrally bound up with the security of Scotland. They're both on the same landmass, that's not going to change. So, again, this would be subject for negotiation. But I think the Scottish intelligence capability, whatever it might be, is something that would not come through inheritance. That would seem to me something which would have to be negotiated. And it's not at all clear to me that it would be as privileged. I don't think it could be as privileged as the United Kingdom currently is, which would imply a greater degree of vulnerability.
Could we maybe come back to the nuclear question later on? And I know you're keen to come into that, but we've got some questions on that later on, and that was just an enormous diversion dealing with a red herring. So we'll maybe stick to the pattern if we can, if we don't mind. I mean, why the next point that we had, and Jim was wanting to raise this, but unfortunately for the reasons I mentioned, he's had to go. I mean, the UK's signed military agreements with France about sharing and cooperating and so on. I mean, surely it's entirely possible that a separate Scotland would be able to sign arrangements with all sorts of other countries, and therefore it wouldn't necessarily be the case that it had to actually own everything or staff everything itself. I mean, I understand the point about the maritime capability and the question of the Arctic, but Scotland wouldn't need to duplicate what everybody else was doing. I mean, it might very well be that in return for doing something close at hand, the Norwegians did all of that altogether. Now, surely that's another scenario which potentially be a great deal cheaper for Scotland and would give it a much greater capability for the pound Scots spent.
That's really exactly the difficulty with Stuart Crawford analysis, is that it doesn't allow for Scotland developing niche capabilities and forfeiting other capabilities on the grounds that partners would provide those, which comes back again to political relationships, doesn't it?
Right.
But the reason that Stuart Crawford's paper goes down that line, and the reason I think most of the analysis that you see goes down the line of what would be a reasonable balance of capabilities rather than what would be a proper niche capability for Scotland to pursue, is that even within NATO, most countries think in national terms. They still don't do the niche capability thing, despite the fact there are enormous amounts of savings and greater efficiencies that could be achieved by doing that, which is precisely why Rasmussen has as Secretary General, has been on the front foot on smart defence, saying we can obviously do our procurement more efficiently. And Scotland could absolutely do that. But if it does that, then it has to recognise that it needs some sort of relationship, and with probably geopolitically with somebody who is reasonably close, because it's
maybe share the border.
Well, sharing a border is one possibility, or sharing access to the North Sea, which is where we've been going, would be the other obvious way. And that's why Britain has a defence relationship with France. But of course, one of the reasons why that defence relationship can operate, despite many cynics' views, to reasonable effect in the case of Libya, is that there is already an existing framework within which that has developed. France, of course, very anxious to get back up to speed in NATO terms. And I think that what Scottish forces would have to be able to do is to remain at the same level of operational competence and interoperability which NATO forces have at the moment. I mean, the extraordinary thing about ISAF in Afghanistan is there are 50 states so many more than there are members of NATO. But those other states are able to operate alongside NATO forces. And of course there are problems. But what is more remarkable in that is the achievement, that actually there are sufficient common operating procedures for these forces to operate alongside each other. So Scotland would have to be able to do that if it wanted to go down the niche capability line.
Two things arise from that. I mean, one is it a fair parallel with, say, Norway and the EU, where normally Norway effectively is not in the EU, but accepts lock, stock and barrel, a whole host of things from Norway, and even if Scotland then didn't join NATO, accepting the a whole, lock, stock and barrel, all the rules and so on, would be effectively the same thing, but would allow, the maiden to preserve her virginity, as it were, would allow Scotland to say, well, we're not in NATO.
NATO is in that position with a great many countries already, really, and Malcolm's already referred to Sweden. Sweden is a classic illustration. It's got troops in Afghanistan. It is effectively, despite its neutrality during the Cold War, it is effectively aligning itself more and more with NATO in terms of what it does. And clearly NATO, and this is where NATO is different from the EU, NATO is very ready to take people in on that basis, essentially. I mean, it is trying to include rather than to exclude.
So the second point I want to make, maybe make that, and then is the question of which niche capabilities would you see Scotland as developing? I mean, apart from kilts, and Highland, I mean, it's difficult to identify anything military that's particularly uniquely Scottish. Or am I mistaken?
Well, the irony here is that the front image is we produce men and we export them, which is what we've been doing for 300 or 400 years, and that's where this image of the Scottish soldier comes from. What actually makes most sense in a less manpower intensive era in terms of defence capability would be, one would have thought, maritime air, because that's where we've been thinking, and that's actually what Scotland seems to need for itself, which it could then apply to others. But of course that isn't where the political sensitivities lie, or the political heat lies. But it is what Scotland would naturally do. You might also say, do the Highlands suggest, well, if we're going to have infantrymen, that they should be mountain troops? The French now make great play of chasseurs alpins and the Italians of Alpini. That you have specialist units with specialist capabilities, and Norway, of course, has done that also in terms of mountain warfare.
But that was 4-5 Commando, in a sense, which is now getting moved away.
South.
That's right, now getting moved away. Sorry, you wanted to come in on the same point.
Niches, and this comes back to the whole issue of the orientation of an independent Scottish Defence Forces. If they are solely for territorial defence and so forth, one of the problems about having niche capabilities, you must be willing to use it, because someone will only want to rely on you if you will turn up on the day when they go, my God, I need whatever it is you're providing. And so, again, based on the very, very scant things from SMP documents, you don't get the impression of an armed force which is looking to deploy anywhere. In which case, you will not be able to have niche armed forces, because no one is going to want to rely on your niches if you will never use them.
But picking up the point about maritime surveillance and so on, I mean, that's different. I mean, as I understood your point about deployment, it was to do with people maybe getting killed. But you're unlikely to have people killed if you're doing maritime deployment or air cover, sorry.
It depends where you are. Depends where you're doing it. If you're talking about maritime surveillance off the coast of Scotland looking for Russian submarines or something, that's one thing. But if you're talking about a maritime air capability deploying to the Gulf, for example, with potentially hostile missiles and air forces, I think you're in quite another scenario.
Sorry, well, I was much more thinking of it in the context of a piece in the jigsaw around the Scottish coast, as it were. But maybe I picked you up wrong. I didn't think that you were suggesting it would be a maritime surveillance capability that then would be transferable worldwide.
Well, I was, if it was to be a niche capability. I mean, if you're thinking beyond the notion of what is an all-round Scottish defence for an independent Scotland, simply defining itself in territorial terms, as opposed to what would you do that Scotland would specialise in on the grounds that it would draw in other specialisations from its allies, whoever they might be, then it seems to be maritime air is what Scotland would naturally do because of where it is in the world and the sort of problems it has. But as has been absolutely said by Francis and Malcolm, you've got to be ready to use that if you want to bring in other efforts.
When we say 12 miles from the Scottish coast,
It's not
niche. But it's not niche. It's non-existent.
And I don't think that, given that, I don't think that is a route which an independent Scotland it would be likely to go down, because it's a very expensive route. You'd be spending a lot of money on a very specialised capability, very little flexibility. It would essentially be accepting that Scottish defence policy was subordinate to UK defence policy, and it would have to be guaranteeing those capabilities would be there on the ground. And I mean, I think I can't see any other small European state which has gone very substantially down this road, because from the point of view of the big powers would love the small powers to have niche capabilities. But from the point of the small powers, they want ones which they can sell to their electorate as being relevant to their own needs.
And perhaps perversely, you look at Afghanistan and ISAF, the Danes, all the Nordics, what have they done? They've deployed infantry battle groups, and boy has NATO been going, please give it, and they have not necessarily said, please send us this niche or that niche, because they've been so short of bodies, they have been crying out loud for troop boots on the ground and so forth. And so these entirely non-niche capabilities from Denmark, Norway and whatever have been welcomed with open arms.
But sorry, can I just be clear then? I mean, is this a disagreement? I mean, that you would not see. It seems to me that your positions are different. Can I just clarify then? You're saying that you can't identify any particular niche capabilities that are likely a separate Scottish state would wish to pursue.
I mean, I think Francis makes a good point that there may be some low-tech areas in which Scotland. I think there will be.
But that's hardly a niche, though, is it? I mean,
in terms of niche, particularly challenging areas where you specialise. No, I don't think that's something which it would be wise for Scotland to pursue in this circumstance. And I don't think they'd be likely to.
No, that's helpful just for us to clarify.
Yes, the difference is simply Malcolm was addressing, if you like, the political acceptability of the issue, and I was saying you could do it that way.
Yes.
But whether it's politically acceptable is another issue entirely.
Well, that's right. And coming back to Francis's point, I mean, the question then of whether or not a separate Scottish state would wish to have boots on the ground in Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere similar is a moot point. I mean, that's something that we decided at the time, but the Scottish presence would not be vital to the progress or success of any such mission. I mean, we'd be buying into something that somebody else was doing or not, as the case might be. We wouldn't really be relied on by anybody. Sorry, Ian, you wanted to pick up a point.
Just what I'm envisioning here as you're paying out is almost a Scottish Defence Force that's either incapable or reluctant to go beyond their borders. So are we in essence talking about a home guard situation here? That's literally what we're setting up.
Well, it seems to me of what Stuart Crawford's paper, we come back to this again, it does seem to be working on that presumption. It doesn't state what the capability is designed to do, precisely because there is no political framework within which it goes. But if it is essentially for defence, and we've used the phrase territorial defence, and of course during the 1980s, 1970s, that was very much a model for states that were aspiring to neutrality within a European context. Is what Yugoslavia was moving towards. It's what Sweden and Norway. Norway had elements of it, but Sweden and Switzerland were doing. That is something which you could see as a possibility for Scotland, and where Scotland might want to go. But equally, if it went there, it implies a big switch away from regulars to reservists, with a weight, and this is why I raised the issue of what the brigade structure would look like and what the balance between regular and reservists would look like, which implies a commitment to defend Scotland and not much more. And one of the reasons that Norway can look as it does is Norway is in the front line, has been in the front line during the Cold War, could be in the front line again. So actually there isn't necessarily an incompatibility between the notion of Norwegian territorial defence and a wider contribution to defence. There is a tension there, and if there is a debate in Norway, it is about whether they should put troops into Afghanistan, whether they should have an expeditionary capability as well. But the core question doesn't arise for Norwegians. It's presumed, and it's been presumed ever since the Germans took by surprise in April 1940. Scotland has no such experience which provides a benchmark, no such experience of invasion, at least since the 18th century. And as a result, it is hard for territorial defence, if that is to be the basis, to capture the imagination or to have any political impetus behind it, because people say, against what? And then we come back to where we began this discussion a couple of hours ago, which is, well, actually, we live in a pretty secure part of the world.
Right. I mean, just picking up that, it does seem to me that a great deal of what we've been discussing about is essentially a home guard with some planes and some boats. But very much that. Can I maybe take us on now the questions of industrial policy in the remaining 4 hours? We're aware of general discussions and debates about procurement and so on, and you'll probably be aware of some announcements and statements that have been made. But I wonder if you could just tell us what your perspective is, or your understanding is of what the likely position is going to be for defence establishments, defence manufacturers within Scotland after separation. How will things pan out? Will everything just carry on as we are at the moment? And if not, why not? And what will happen? Francis, you seem to be keenest to speak.
You can look cause, effect, whatever. Why does the United States have the biggest defence industry? It's where the money's spent. Looking at Europe, is the Belgian defence industry the size of the French defence industry? No, it isn't. Why? Belgians spend very little on defence. The industry follows the money. Pure and simple. We may not quite have the political allegiance they have in the States of, have you got a manufacturing facility in Wisconsin and one here and one there, that whole sort of element of pork barrel. But defence, and forget all the EU has said it'll be trans-border procurement. Yeah, I'm sure it will be for bootlaces and bottled water. But for the key systems, there is the political resonance, security of supply, and just very simple things like, again, size of budgets. What would be the size of the independent Scottish research and development budget? God knows the budget in the UK at the moment is going down. But if you were to look at the possible ranges and an independent Scotland having potentially £20–25 million, how many defence companies would keep the same size of estate in a country with that level of R&D, or will they not just move it to where the money is? Now, it is very easy to move these factories, and the engineers follow as well. And just give one example, and perhaps very relevant, shipyards. When VT Group closed their facility in Southampton, moved to Portsmouth, cost 14 million quid. And that didn't even make them think twice. And by the way, that yard is now building, part of BAE Systems, building major portions of ships for the carrier programme. You could build the next generation of ships there very easily. I think people have ignored in the past. Again, look at just rationalisation with BAE Systems of the different factories they've got. Brough, closing down, moving most of the work out to India, so forth. Growth of Samlesbury, Wharton. It is a lot easier to flex factory demand within the defence industry than you'd think. And so the idea that, again, that could take decades before it moved. No, if you ended up with an independent Scottish defence force with limited capabilities and low-tech capabilities at that, those facilities will be down in Britain within months. End. It goes where the money is, pure and simple. And but there would still be cross-border procurement and so forth. I think you need to look at the examples, again, of companies like Thales, which is international. They move their facilities to where the money is. And in the case of air defence, they closed down all of their French facilities and moved them to the UK, because that's where the budget was for their particular niche. So that's happening across borders as well. MBDA, the Missile House, they do the same. They move their facilities to where the money is. And
that has the view of the benefit of clarity, doesn't it? I don't think we're in much doubt then about what you're saying. Did the other two agree with that?
I think that's substantially right, and it may take a little longer than Francis says. It depends on how this process goes. But one thing that a Scottish government in such a scenario would be able to say is we have some procurement budget, and if we are going to buy some things from the rest of the UK, then there has to be some flow in the other direction. But given the budgetary numbers we've talked about already, I think the size of that Scottish procurement budget is going to be pretty limited, and the sort of work that's done in Scotland at the moment, there's clearly a lot of work on the naval shipbuilding side and the carrier and possibly in the Type 26, which maybe we'll come on to later. But in addition, there's work on the F-35, paveway bombs and things of this nature. But most of the other projects are, when you go back and see what it's equipping things which one can't imagine Scotland buying. I can't imagine Scotland buying F-35 aircraft, for example. And now, the companies will make commercial judgments about whether or not to relocate. And they will look at what signals they are being given on existing contracts, and they will look at what signals they are being given by their paymasters in Washington or in London or elsewhere. And they'll also look at their employees, whether they're prepared to relocate across the border. So I don't think everything will leave on day one, but I think the trend will be a pretty clear one, because why should the UK government in this scenario support jobs in Scotland in the defence area unless it's clearly more cost effective to buy from those suppliers? So Scotland may have some industrial niches, but they'll have to fight much harder. I mean, the last point I suppose I'd make, which is one that was made in the seminar in Edinburgh Hew and I attended last week, is that this scenario will put a lot of burden on a Scottish government having an active industrial policy.
Yes.
And it doesn't, not only in the defence sector, of course, but there will be a very important role, and you need to ask people who know much more about industrial policy than I do, to how they would envisage providing a structure which allows Scotland's defence sector to be much more export-oriented, because it would have to be much more export-oriented than it is now in order to survive at anything like that.
And have you detected any signs of an industrial policy being developed as part of the separation debate?
I have not, but maybe I'm simply ignorant.
Has it been detected? I mean, I must confess, I haven't detected it, but I mean, I was presuming that you were closer, certainly in relation to defence industrial strategy, and I thought you might have.
My impression is that the defence industries, it's interesting how politically silent they have been, but they have been very silent, and whether that has enabled has eased the pressure on the development, on the need to develop a defence industry policy or not, I wouldn't know, but I suspect it has. That if actually they had been as explicit as you've heard both these two gentlemen being, and I would have no reason to dissent from what they've said, that really this is pretty bad news potentially for Scottish defence industries, then you would have expected them to say rather more than they have, but they haven't.
I think we can discuss why they might not be saying it, but my impression is, from the discussions that I've had with companies, is that they don't want to get drawn into what they see as party politics.
Absolutely.
And they will say privately, my view is X or my view is Y, but the company is not taking a view because we will have to survive after the referendum, but commercially this is what makes sense. And they outline a case pretty much along the same lines as Francis. But they don't want to be drawn on that, lest they are seen to be bullying the electorate and all the rest of it, right? I mean, I have got a particular interest in shipbuilding, since I have got Govan shipyard within my constituency. Now, it has been said that any suggestion that yard will not continue to get both Royal Navy orders and a mass of export orders is simply talking Scotland down, does not fully recognise the merits of the workforce. We have the best engineers in the world. People will want to come here and build their ships here. We will be able to win competitions against anybody, and so on and so forth. How would you respond to that?
Well, that is the key issue, I think, there is to ask who will make the decisions as to whether or not to place orders with those yards in Scotland. And to date, the overwhelming, very substantial part of the work that's been done in those yards has been for a UK customer. So for the UK customer, they're clearly not more likely, I think, to place orders in Scotland after independence than they are at present. I would suggest they're much less likely to do so, because of I mean, again, it's a political analysis, so politicians here can disagree with my analysis. I think if Scotland were to become independent before decisions had been made about where to build new Type 26 frigates, for example, I think I don't understand what political makeup could then, in those circumstances, make the UK government place the orders in Scottish yards if there were, and there are, alternative places to build them in England.
And also the terms of business agreement, which would be a remaining UK government agreement on building and maintenance ships, and independent Scotland is saying we are no longer part of that.
Would that be?
No, but surely the TOBA is with BAE Systems.
But also talking about a UK national capability. They have been charged to provide a capability at a national level.
It's not clear who would inherit that agreement, of course.
Well, but this is signed with the UK government, and I would say I suspect you're finding that someone says, great, we've just got rid of one overhaul yard and two new build shipyards. We have just sorted out a significant element of our industrial problems.
And it comes back to Francis's point about he who buys determines where it's built. Type 26s, I think only a very limited number are going to be bought because they're getting so expensive, but those which are bought will be UK ships, they will not be Scottish ships.
I mean, the analysis that you've given, which is very clear, all of you, is that there'll be a drift of this expenditure from Scotland to England.
Yeah.
Which I understand the logic of that. And I suppose the only question I have is that Scotland will have 10% of procurement spend, roughly speaking, going forwards, if they decide to keep it at roughly that level. How much of the UK's procurement defence spend capability is currently in Scotland? Well, because your argument is only valid if it's significantly more than 10%.
But coming to something Hew said earlier about the joint facilities, there will still be a requirement in the Rump UK for a Dartmouth Naval College for Sandhurst. Depending on decisions taken by the independent Scottish Government, they may have to bear the costs of overheads of new facilities, and so the 10% will not necessarily buy as much as would seem.
A diseconomy
of scale.
The fundamental argument is still right that there is still some procurement spend in Scotland post-independence, and they can put that where they want. And presumably they would put that in Scotland.
But the crucial issue is what will they want to procure?
Yes, it is.
And what they will want to procure, on all the indications we've had so far, will be at the low end of capability and low tech end.
So the sort of stuff that you don't need government.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the other aspect of this, the converse of that, is that, and it goes back, I think, to what the chairman was asking, which is, or raising, which is the argument that says, well, actually, because the Clyde has a reputation, because shipbuilding in Scotland is particularly good, therefore country A, not the Rump United Kingdom, but country A somewhere else will want to order ships from the Clyde. This comes back to an assumption that you will want to order ships, warships specifically, from a yard which is not producing ships that are being used in action elsewhere. I mean, in the end, the way you sell arms, in part, is by proven military effectiveness. It's actually by employment. Krupp learned this before the First World War. If you want to sell Krupp artillery, you do it on the back of the German army's reputation, because the German army is using Krupp artillery to great effect. And I think it will be very hard for, over the long term, for a Scotland that has warships of limited capability to continue to argue that it's capable of building ships of high capability for other countries.
The other thing is, if you look at the world's naval market, more and more countries are saying, do you know what, we've actually got some industry, but we'd like to develop it, and we're willing to pay, so have you got a design, and we will build them in our country. So if you're looking at the lower end corvettes, the light frigates, the chances of there being, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the United Kingdom today or Rump Scotland, Rump UK tomorrow, the chances of huge programmes building lower end ships in the British Isles is incredibly limited. There will be some design work, no doubt, but all the work will be done overseas. And we should bear in mind, Type 26, talking to a number of countries potentially interested to join the development programme and so forth. How many of those ships, if, for the sake of argument, Canada or Japan signed up for Type 26, how many will be built in Britain? 0. They will all be built overseas. And this is recognised straight off. If you were able to get an order, let us say, from Saudi Arabia, they haven't got the manufacturing capability. So you would build those in a British Isles yard. But quite frankly, again, you were mentioning the capability and the cost of the Type 26. This is a ship which, at the moment, potentially is probably of only interest to 8 countries, and they would all build them in their own shipyards. So the one of you're doing the yards down, the market
the Koreas of this world, actually it is places like Korea, not even Italian yards, Spanish yards. It's places like Korea which are starting to build the next generation of corvettes. Why? They've just got the capability and the skills and the cost base. And it is why with the Type 26 from the word go, trying to believe we would be building dozens of ships in Britain to export was realised that's just not what the market's doing.
Can I just come back to the headline numbers very briefly? If you had a Scottish defence budget of about $2 billion a year, and they spent 40% of that on equipment, new equipment and equipment maintenance, which is, I think, quite high, you'd be talking about 800 million a year. And a lot of that would be small-scale suppliers and so on. Quite a bit of it, I think, would be buying things from overseas. If you wanted a maritime patrol aircraft for Scotland, for example, you're not going to design and develop it in Scotland. You're going to buy something off the shelf like the P3. And according to the figures from the government here, it's the defence sales from Scottish companies right now are about 1.8 billion a year. So that's quite a significant difference. So I mean, there would still be a market in Scotland.
Point. I mean, just for the avoidance of doubt, though, we've heard that the Scottish provide infantry battalions at a greater than their share, if you like. In terms of procurement, then, does Scotland provide a higher proportion than you would expect, given its relative size within the UK at the moment?
Of defence production?
Yes. Yes.
I'm not sure it does actually.
So if it doesn't, then the issue isn't so much that. The issue is that you've taken the view that Scotland's going to have a much smaller home guard type outfit, and therefore the stuff they'll be buying is more commodity based, which is therefore what takes you to your 800 billion number versus the 1.8, which is where you get the analysis that places like Govan wouldn't be used in the same way as they are now.
Right.
And that's right, isn't it?
That's right.
And just on another naval one, in terms of business frequency, how much business there is there long term, should bear in mind the Norwegians, for their new generation frigates, had them built in Spanish shipyards simply because they had not ordered ships for so long that they did not have the capabilities any longer. They could have probably resurrected them. They just took the decision it was going to cost far too much time, and there was a serious business risk. And that is a point. And those are actually quite sophisticated ships as well. So you have to ask if a country like Norway, with spending nearly £1 billion a year on procurement, says, do you know what, guys? And they still have a maritime industry, but they said, do you know what, guys? We'll let the Spanish do it. It's not been without troubles, by the way. That's one of the higher spending smaller countries in Europe. Question, if that's the decision they took, why would that not be the same sort of
that slightly undermines your argument that people have to, that spending is going to go to where it's commissioned, because actually you could say, why wouldn't the Norwegians go to Govan in that instance?
Because actually at the time there was no, this comes back to the point, there was no evidence of any decent product.
But in future, if people are prepared to do that, which is interesting.
Because the Spanish were producing ships of a type already for their own navy, the F-100 class, and the Norwegians looked at them and went, do you know what, that's pretty much what we're looking at. They was going to be using the same radar, same battle management system, same missiles, and in effect they were looking to try and get economies of scale working off the back of it. Didn't quite work that way, but
I was speaking to a defence supplier last night who was saying that but the Norwegians and the Swedes have got some defence industries. You know, they have managed to survive. There are some niche capabilities that they have managed now, you know, to target and to achieve. Now, surely that is a scenario that's entirely possible for Scotland.
yeah, I would say it is still fascinating how often when the Norwegians are faced with buying something from Sweden and something from anyone else in the world, they will go for the anyone else in the world. There are those little historical bits of you were our rulers for however many centuries and we haven't bloody forgotten this. It's why I personally think they should have bought the Gripen aircraft a long time ago, and every time it's offered in new configurations, they lead Saab up a garden path for a year, and at the last minute go off and buy something else. And they almost take delight in doing it. Yes, there are areas where they have been very successful in collaborating on procurement, and I think probably looking ahead, you will see deeper procurement between the Norwegians and the Swedes. Yes, absolutely, and the Danes for that matter. But I'm still fascinated that there is this, it's not even residual, right. There is still this quite large
historical knowledge and the Norwegians kick back against the Swedes.
Whether or not that develops between Scotland and England then is a point that no doubt we can investigate in 20 years' time. But Norway has managed and Sweden has managed to have some niche manufacturing capabilities in relation to defence. I mean, why should not Scotland not have that? Instead of being, an all-purpose, all singing and dancing producer of ships, tanks, planes, I mean, just some focus on particular things. Now, I suppose this comes back to the question of industrial policy, doesn't it? Yeah. Of which there is presently none. But were there one, it might be possible. Is that?
I think that's right.
I'm looking for some sort of light, and hope from you, because I mean you've been pretty pessimistic.
Maritime is probably the area because there is still an offshore industry. So weir pumps, that is one of those capabilities. Which is it possible to move it elsewhere? Yes. Actually, because you're not talking about a complete ship, a complete aircraft, something big. Is anyone necessarily in London going to care that the main pumps for the nuclear submarines are coming out of Scotland? No. Much in the same way, again, rather hilariously, the fasteners on the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier all come from a British company which is called Nelson. They only found out when they saw the names on the fasteners. There are certain things which are almost internationally traded items now. Probably actually tireless periscopes up in the old Bar and Stroud. That's the type of thing where would anyone in the remaining UK in 10 years' time say, I am going to pay for someone to move that facility away from there? Probably not.
I think. Sorry. Can I just? I mean, that is also by coincidence in my constituency.
I hadn't guessed.
Right. No. Well, you haven't researched adequately then. But I thought that was one of those actually where the question of following the market, following the customer. Some of those items would actually be moved.
Probably the advantage there is the market is so specialised and niche, and again business flows are such that actually if you look at the amount of turnover from that facility which are going on export anyway, they're doing quite nicely. Great, so we've got the Astute class, they're going to do 6 boats, so potentially with a few spares, about 14 or 15 units over 30 years. That's the sort of area the company would say, well, if you want us to move south, what happens after that is finished?
Yes.
What are we meant to be doing? However, on the other side of the coin, for example, the old Ferranti works at Edinburgh with all the radars and electronic warfare. All of their future business is going to be in supporting Typhoons down south, and then in support of Saudi contracts and so forth. That's the type of business that would move.
Well, that's interesting because that was a particular example that was quoted to me as one that wouldn't, because the experts in Edinburgh, the engineers in Edinburgh were so good that they couldn't be replicated anywhere else, and if the plant moved, they wouldn't go with it because they love Edinburgh so much, and they would go off rather than be taxi drivers or work in the trams or anything else rather than move.
All I'll say is I think you'll be surprised quite how, in the broader sense, international that workforce is.
Right.
It is not it is working for an international company. Support facilities will all be down south. They are anyway. That if there is no R&D budget in an independent Scotland to support radar developments and so forth, and no support. Right. Why is
so? The key issue. The key issue is rather than the location of the skills, in feature terms, it is the R&D budget and who has got it and who is going to spend it, and that is what will determine.
And just giving an example as well about what happens to skilled engineers and loving the place they work and so forth. Before the TOBA got signed, on the submarine side, Barrow was wasting away at a rate of knots because there was physically no work in Barrow for the engineers, who, funnily enough, loved living on the edge of the Lake District. They had a gorgeous halcyon life, but they were getting bored, rigid, and they were leaving. And they were taking jobs all over the rest of the UK and the rest of Europe. If you love the engineering you do, and you're in a job where you are literally sitting at a desk with no work, you actually tend to move pretty quickly. That was the experience of highly skilled maritime submarine engineers at Barrow. They were just leaving, and they were going off, funnily enough, to work at Rolls-Royce, They were going off to work in other businesses because there was no work. And it was only once the tow bus said, no, you won't just be paid to sit at your desk, you'll be paid to carry on working on submarines, doing real work. That was about the only thing that got people going. And again, why become an apprentice in a factory where you basically don't do the work? So I would say that's a very physical, real example. If people say, how do you know this has happened? That's what happened at Barrow. And again, the defence, I'm always surprised quite how many people you meet 15 years ago in one defence company in Britain, and then you meet them 5 years later with a totally different one in a different area. I suppose because engineers of a certain type are still in short supply, but the demand is high. They are commodities and they move. And they get poached. Believe me, at the moment there is a very, very lively transfer market between some of the companies, and I wouldn't see that changing.
Is that a view that the two others would accept?
I think to a large extent it is. I mean, I think industrial policy is important. I think some of these technologies are dual use. They have a civilian as well as a military dimension. And I don't think that all manufacturing industry is going to flee from Scotland in the months after independence. It will depend, but so much will depend on international competitiveness and whether a new Scottish government, independent Scottish government, had the structures and regulations in place to support it properly. In the specific area of defence, having export control regulations, which were easy for companies to relate to, would be very important, because Scotland, an independent Scotland, would have to have a separate set of export control regulations. Would that regulate exports between different parts of the old United Kingdom? Would you have to have an export licence to send a pump from Scotland to another subsidiary in England?
But if you assume that a separate Scotland behaves rationally, they would want to minimise. No, I mean,
yes, they would.
They would have an interest in minimising that. There's EU rules. I mean, there are a number of problems here, but I don't necessarily see that as being one of them.
I don't think that's an insuperable obstacle. I'm really just adding something else to the very long list of things which a new Scottish government would have to put in place. In most areas of Scottish life, it's already devolved to Scotland. In defence, there's a whole number of things. It's not simply a case of transferring units from one authority to another. It's putting into place a whole system of government, and export control is something which would have to be done right. Otherwise, if you got it wrong, you might tip the balance in terms of location. And I think companies don't want disruption. There will be some costs from moving facilities from one place to another. So if they can keep it there, fine. But all the signals would have to be right on both sides of the border.
Perhaps it comes back to your one of reasonable behaviour when you come to the break-up, is that if everything is done in a slightly harsh, ill-tempered manner, then you will see harsh and potentially ill-tempered decisions being taken on both sides. The chances of, say, the old Franti factory staying in Scotland will be multiplied manyfold if there is a very, very benign, well thought out and non-rancorous split. You then just say it's going to be on...
And you may believe that, but I mean, at the moment, the Scottish Parliament won't even allow us to meet in their building. So it's, the signs are not good at the moment. But David, I wonder if I could just turn to question 11, because we want to question 10. Sorry, we want to pick that up.
In a way, we've covered it really. Or I mean, the question was around the extent to which procurement would continue outside borders, and I think what you've said is that it would be minimal.
And just perhaps coming off the back there...
I mean, and that there's no EU procurement issue around that would change that.
In theory, even defence is meant to become more open market. Right. However, they are rules and regulations which are so easy to work your way around. If you do want to continue buying from your own domestic suppliers, they are not. It will take many, many, many decades before those are...
Has the EU ever enforced the defence procurement?
I think occasionally they sent a slightly peeved note to someone claiming that they should look again.
That'll really frighten them, I would have thought.
And in those cases, the note was never answered.
I mean, presumably the distinction would occur between bootlaces, as you described, which I suppose they would and frigates.
Well, and actually, surely one of the biggest criticisms of the UK's defence industrial policy, which of course doesn't exist, is that overclothing, bootlaces and so forth, even when there are perfectly decent suppliers in the country,
the absolute resolute driving down costs at all level means it all goes to China. So there is an open market, but not necessarily for high-tech defence equipment or items which are deemed to be very vital to specific subsystems.
And that's really the point, isn't it? I mean, the dual-use argument, it's about things for which there is an open market that Scotland might thrive in, rather than things for which the market is a much more restricted and closed one.
Can I just, one further point about the question of the EU, but in the event that it is decided that a particular procurement contract is going to be placed outside the UK or the rest of the UK, my understanding is that under EU legislation, Scotland would not be able to get favourable treatment on that. I mean, they couldn't say that we're not going to buy it from, within our own borders, but we are going to buy it from Scotland, because presumably that would be contrary to EU competition legislation. And because I was under the impression that the competition legislation, or the exemption under, I think it's 236 or something similar, only applied to your own boundaries. It didn't apply just to your pals, or who might not be your pals by the time you get to that position. Is that a fair assessment?
If anyone was ever able to fully enforce EU competition rules as defence equipment is concerned, then you would not be able to do show favour to any particular source. But as I say, you can get around these regulations so easily if you want to.
Sorry, can I just be clear then? You are saying that if the UK wanted to favour Scotland in placing defence orders over anybody else in the EU, they would be able to do so?
The simplest way is you just ensure, especially if someone is an incumbent manufacturer, they will have the inside knowledge on the product, the user, how the user uses the product and so forth, which will be worth tens of millions of pounds in research costs and so forth. If they can't, on the basis of that, then come in with a cheaper bid, then there's something wrong about the business. It is very easy, and it happens all over Europe, that the incumbent or the preferred supplier, someone just writes the specification around a specific product that no one else possesses. Believe me, that's happening every day.
So that would only happen in circumstances where there was an incumbency advantage?
Unless you have cases where someone has a product you believe is the one you want, and therefore your operational capability guys write the operational capability around that product. So when you then come to the contracting, someone goes, oh, I'm amazed. Out of the 6 people who are offering, only 1 person can meet it. That is one of the oldest tricks in the book for any procurement agency. As I say, it goes on with a shocking frequency.
But what you've said anyway is that the UK is buying stuff in China, if it can. So therefore the likelihood of it favouring Scotland is pretty remote in that instance.
If you were looking at those low-value commodity items and so forth, it would be incredibly limited. There's been no evidence of anyone wishing to show favour towards UK suppliers in this area.
Sort of Ireland and Norway and Denmark over the last decade or so, have we seen much in the way of joint procurement? I mean, have they sort of said, right, we're all quite small, let's get together and do stuff?
There's been some. It's not... Well, actually, the NH90 helicopter, the Nordic nations teamed together, realising they would get better bargaining power if they actually...
I'm just wondering, is that a model for Scotland? That you could see that they were of a similar size, and therefore that's what they'll have to do.
It would make the defence pounds or whatever go a hell of a lot further than if they tried just to spend on their own. Ireland actually does piggyback off the UK a little bit in some areas, piggybacks off other countries, on the lines of, if you're buying 6 of them, can we buy 1? If you look at then, for example, Luxembourg, and I'm not saying it's a direct comparison at all, A400 transport aircraft, the Luxembourg bourgeois are piggybacking on Belgium and saying, well, when you buy yours, can we chuck one on the production line? That is a model which does work for the smaller states. Has worked in helicopters before, does work in sort of consumables like guided weapons.
I suppose it's not a model that lends itself particularly well to a large indigenous defence industry, because actually what you're doing is you're taking marginal capacity from other people's industries and
It is actually the model you would expect Scotland to end up. It's the model you would expect Scotland to end up.
It's very rational, but it's not one that gives you an indigenous defence industry.
Right. Well, the final major area that we want to touch on, we touched on earlier, which is the question of nuclear. Alan?
Well, I better declare interest at Faslane and Coalport are in my constituency. Maybe start with Francis, because I mean earlier Francis had seemed to suggest it would be fairly straightforward to replicate the facilities elsewhere. Was that both for the Trident submarines and the Astute submarines?
Look, in terms of especially the boats themselves,
yes,
there is no shortage of place they can be based all over the rest of the UK. There are facilities nuclear cleared for handling of those boats. You know, Devonport, you've still got a facility in Portsmouth can take them. And okay, this is ignoring for the moment issues like sea access and the lanes, but Barrow, there are more nuclear facilities around than people have thought. I have to say, there is a degree of people, and I've had this from the Royal Navy saying, oh, we can't possibly move from Faslane. You go, well, okay, what if an independent Scotland tells you you have to move? And one admiral said, well, we won't. Well, I went, well, hang on, sorry, this one, if that is the standard of debate, then there is a degree of denial here, and that's actually what put me down the line of actually going around to start seeing where things might go, and finding out that there is almost replicated support facilities, funnily enough, the Barrow and Faslane. So in terms of something, is there a ship lift at Barrow? Yeah, sure.
And would there be enough space for all the Trident and Astute submarines?
Barrow, you could probably only go 2, but Milford Haven, they have looked, and you get all 4 in there. But remember, once it's
but there's all the Astute ones as well.
Oh, the Astute go down to Devonport. There's more than enough room there. There is a degree, as I say, it's article of faith. It can't be moved. The nuclear coast, Cumbria, could they take a facility? Yeah, sure. They've got Barrow there, which is nuclear cleared. They've handled nuclear warheads. The option, I say, the ones like Aldermaston and Burfield, people haven't thought about these because they said, oh, we can't use them. And you're going, especially in the aftermath of announcements, spending £5 billion extra on keeping the facilities going, the infrastructure built up. Well, these are places where nuclear warheads are stored anyway.
Yes, but you have at Coalport and at Glen Douglas, you have massive underground stores for weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear. Could you replicate those at Barrow?
If you want to, yes, sure.
But how long would it take you?
The nuclear ones would take longer, but that's why you use Aldermaston and Burfield in the short term. Yeah, the larger ones, I think you need to bear in mind how many other facilities all over Britain are actually sold off. Digging extra bunkers in, especially in the southwest with high unemployment. I think if you were to be a really Machiavellian politician trying to take votes away from the Lib Dems, trying to get some more Tory votes down in the southwest, I think you'd be chucking quite a lot of work down in the southwest. Likewise, Wales. You're telling me there aren't plenty of facilities, areas where you couldn't be putting these facilities in Wales?
So how long would it take, do you estimate, to be able to replicate the facilities?
Well, everyone always says it would take decades. If you said, how long does it take to build Coalport in the first place?
I have no idea.
In terms of the actual physical engineering, it's about 3.5–4 years. So, but in the meantime, I say, is there any reason why A, can't use Aldermaston and Burfield to store the warheads? Can't speak to our bestest friends across the channel now, who've got spare facilities, and could we ask them to borrow some bunkers? Something tells me Monsieur Hollande would probably say yes. I say, just the article of faith of you could never move any of the boats anywhere, none of the facilities could be replicated anywhere else, and it would all take far, far too long. I have to say, it just comes from people like the Navy guy going, it just can't happen.
So, I just want to pursue Francis first. I'll come to get maybe an alternative view in a minute. But what about the workforce? You've a skilled workforce at Faslane. There are sailors that have between workers and sailors, several thousand people that obviously have to be housed somewhere.
Skilled workforce at Devonport, handling nuclear submarines for the last, 30–40 years. There's no shortage of people down there to do it. Barrow, in terms of the maintenance and overhaul, they're building these things.
Where would you house the sailors?
Sorry?
The sailors and
if you've seen how many spare houses there are on barracks down at Plymouth, they're actually considering selling 3 or 4 of the barrack spaces down at Plymouth. Now, again, actually coming back to a point made far earlier about why aren't some of these issues raised before we even get to a referendum, I think it is very worrying that the issue, especially of just property sales, land sales across the UK, regardless, people come up with decisions to sell facilities.
without really thinking of some of the longer term conclusions. And I've only heard of one person who is looking back at the estates plan at a lowish level in the Navy going, okay, what if? But the view is there is Plymouth, they're going to be downsizing of Plymouth quite substantially. There is a lot of areas of housing. I know that the sea the sea close to it is regarded as being not ideal, but they've been basing S-boats and T-boats out there for decades. So it can't have been that unideal, otherwise they'd have moved years ago.
But you have it, I mean, presumably the Navy has these stores at Coolport and Glen Douglas for a good reason. You seem to be suggesting that we could base the warheads at Aldermaston, but they have to be loaded onto the submarines, maintained. Presumably, I don't know the technical details of how you go about doing that, but I would have thought storing it at Aldermaston and then loading it onto a submarine at Barrow, you may need the intermediate storage space that you currently have at Coolport.
But you've got nuclear-rated facilities at Barrow anyway. Again, it's art of possible, and the art is possible. And would it be, in the short term, as easy as Coalport? No, because it's just across the loch, short drive and so forth. But the idea that it is impossible to countenance any changes. I come back to the fact, even the warhead stock are going in and out of Burfield for overhaul, maintenance. There are nuclear convoys driving up and down the motorways, maybe not quite on a daily basis, but it is not a once in a 10-year thing. Mm-hmm. This is happening.
So how much of an increase in nuclear convoys then would you have if you were basing your warheads at Aldermaston and then loading them at Barrow?
Naturally more than if you were across the loch between Gairloch Head and Coalport. Of course it's going to be more. But again, this comes back to a very simple one. If there was an independent Scotland with the nukes leave, this comes back to one of...
So how long would it, if they were given, say, a year to get out, would that be long enough?
Okay, look, the boats, the ship lifts and so forth could sail south. Literally within, as long as they've got the crew to man them, they could sail south.
Right.
Could they find them barrack space in and around Plymouth to stay in while they sort? No, of course they can. Yeah, the warheads are more problematic because you can't, unfortunately, just chuck them on Eddie Stobart and leave them at service stations. You have to take care of them. But there are more options open than people have really thought about. And as I say, I put it to a French admiral not that long ago, would he object to having British nuclear warheads stored? And his reaction was, no, of course not, we've got spare facilities. Yeah. And actually, bear in mind the sort of rapprochement between the two nations, he thought it would be an excellent idea.
Okay, right, okay, thanks Francis. Maybe Malcolm and Hew maybe have a different viewpoint.
I do. Well, I think nothing is impossible, and Francis is quite right to say that. I think it would be much more difficult than he suggests. And one of the things that I've done in the past is look at the public records which are now available of the surveys which the government did right back in the early 60s as to all the alternative bases and all the ones which Francis has just mentioned were looked at in that process. And there were good reasons why they ended up with Scottish locations right at the top of the list of preferences. I mean, I think it's given enough time. So Milford Haven, I think, and a lot of the issues at that time, which I think would be greatly intensified today, would be in relation to the safety margins, which the Nuclear Installations Inspectorate would insist on, which dramatically, unless you're prepared to rehouse a very large number of civilians and close down areas of housing and so on, does really limit where you can put particular facilities. I mean, the issue of Aldermaston, I think, is not really relevant. Aldermaston isn't on the coast. The issue at Aldermaston, of course, is where we go to refurbish warheads in any case. So that's already part of the operating cycle. The issue is there another coastal location in England or Wales or Northern Ireland which could replicate what we have at Faslane and Coolport? I think Devonport is a possibility.
So are you ruling out Milford Haven and Barrow?
Of Milford Haven, I think the issue is that that was quite high on the list in the past. There are these large LNG facilities there now, which weren't there in the past. And I mean, perhaps somebody should look at that again. But I think the idea that you could base these facilities there with this very important economic industrial facility there today, which wasn't there back in the 60s. I think there are some real problems, and that certainly people I've talked to suggest that that's not on the cards. Barrow, again, I mean, this is going beyond my level of expertise, but certainly in the past there have been issues raised about how deep the channel is there, and whether you'd have to do a lot of dredging, whatever it might be, in order to ensure that submarines could go in and out on a very frequent basis. So you'd have to tackle that issue, and of course you'd have to have a facility, facilities which were sufficiently distant from population centres in relation to safety margins. So again, you'd have to look at that. That Barrow was certainly rejected in the past for those reasons. And in terms of going to the southwest of the country, what we argued when William Walker and myself wrote something about this in the past is that given enough time, you could carve out an area for the fast lane type facility in Devonport, given enough time and expense. It would take some time, but you could do it, and France is absolutely right in that respect. The issue would be the Coolport facility, which would have to be, you could put the Coalport facility in Devonport because there simply isn't the room, given the safety margins, which would be higher now than they were in the 60s, dictate. There was at that time, there continues to be discussion about a location near Falmouth for the Coolport facility, which is a possibility. It would involve, I think, moving a significant number of people and planning permission and so on. And I'm not
would
sure
the distance between Falmouth and Devonport cause problems?
I think given the rather more relaxed operating environment we have today compared with the past, it might be possible.
Right.
It's certainly be more possible in having a much larger Devonport Barrow sort of arrangement, or sort of thing that Francis is talking about. I suppose I'm rather less. If you get to a situation in which the UK has no choice, then the first thing they would do is they'd take the warheads to Aldermaston, and basically continuous at-sea deterrence would end. And then the Navy would be told, well, how long is it going to take you to regain this?
Right.
And the politicians would be asked, what political price and what financial price are you prepared to pay to restore continuous at-sea deterrence? Are you prepared? Because I think there would be an awful lot of NIMBYism wherever you wanted to put this Coolport facility. Now, maybe employment concerns. So
noises off there. Just carry on.
So there might be employment considerations as well. You'd have to look at the location and talk to the people, because people down in Falmouth at the moment, having a nuclear weapon facility in their backyard is not right at the top of their agenda, and it would be in this scenario. I think that would just take a very long time to work through, and very uncertain where it would all end. There would be some period in that process of rapid expulsion where the UK no longer had a continuous at-sea deterrence. And in a way, there would be a bluff going on between Scotland and the UK, in which the UK government has no interest in a referendum discussion, or even after a referendum, saying, oh yes, we can relocate. No problem. And the Scottish government has a very difficult choice, because if it pushes this issue and says, well, we don't care, that's your problem, not ours, then the diplomatic and other costs would be very substantial. But I think the UK government's reluctance to go down that road is, in my view, based on really considerable worries about the safety and the politics and the costs, and all those combined mean that, of course, if the UK was faced with an imminent threat, if we were in May 1940, then a way would be found. I mean, I don't doubt that, but we're not in that sort of situation.
I mean, the point that strikes me, I mean, we're building aircraft carriers which are not going to have aircraft on them for a while. So, it's entirely possible in defence terms to have a gap in capability, isn't it? And therefore, and given, well, I mean, who knows what might happen in the next 2 or 3 years, but at the moment, it does not look as if we're likely to require a deterrent, since, if nothing else, we're in an alliance, both with the French and with the Americans, both of whom do have nuclear weapons.
And of course, that proposal, a gap, is being canvassed as a possibility in the British case anyway in relation to nuclear deterrence. But can I just pick up the NIMBYs point? Because actually, when I talked about this with Michael Quinlan, who was the Permanent Under-Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, the man who is most often credited with having underpinned at least some of British thinking on this. And he always used to scoff when I would say, what are you going to do when there's a Scottish Nationalist Party in power and there is pressure to do exactly what we're talking about? And when he lived long enough to see the SNP form a government, if not have an absolute majority, and he said, well, I have got to take it seriously now. And his response was entirely along the lines of the political difficulty of doing what's been described, that actually people would resist having the Coolport equivalent, especially in their part of the world, because he assumed, as Malcolm's assumed, that the most likely place would have to be adjacent to Devonport, and that it would be Devonport that they would have to go to. And he could not see you're being able to do that from scratch now, as opposed to being able to do it in the 1960s, while the Cold War provided the impetus and the political acceptability for what you were doing, and that he thought we were now in a very different place when there was so much more public scepticism about the value of nuclear weapons without the imperative of the Cold War, that it would be very hard to get people to accept this happening adjacent to their homes. So I entirely accept that, of course, in a recession, employment opportunities might work against that. But your constituency MPs, and you can reflect on this, the dynamics of this relationship better than any of us can, but that he thought was the most likely case. Of course, he wasn't a constituency MP. So he stressed the Coolport aspect of it particularly, and how effectively you could move that, and really whether you could move it to the southwest, which is where he presumably would have to be.
One very, very significant difference between the 60s, 70s, whenever. The size of the facility we would be looking at is less than half, because the number of nuclear warheads the UK at the moment is stating it wants. So instead of 500, 800, of which about 190 would be on one boat, the remainder being largely in Coolport, you are looking at potentially under 100 warheads. Physically, the size of the facility is going to be a fraction of that of Coolport. And that is one of the reasons why I have to, and again, I had these debates with Navy guys, and they were always going, it's too difficult. I'm going, I honestly don't believe they have thought of it. I have spoken with people, former BA Systems guys, and they're saying, Barry, yeah, look, the channel, great, you dredge it out. This is what a lot of other countries, including the US Navy, do. When annoying sandbars start growing, they get a dredger and they just dredge it. This is so, there's going to be the problem with Portsmouth. They're based on carriers in Portsmouth. They've accepted they will have to have a long-term contract with someone to dredge the channel. Don't notice anyone getting particularly uptight about that. They make and launch boats at Barrow anyway. Could you use that as a loading facility? And actually, I'm now just trying to think in terms of operational bases. Is actually the ballistic missile storage site down in Georgia, is that actually an operational boomer base?
Yes.
Are you sure? Because I thought they were up in Bangor, Maine. Or is it just...
No.
So...
I thought...
Right.
The issue of Barrow, I mean, dredging, you're right. In principle, that it would cost something because you'd have to maintain it continuously. But the issue of warhead basing is the number one safety issue. That severely constrains war. And Coolport may, I think Francis is right, it could be smaller because of the smaller size of the force, but you would still have to have the safety assurance in relation to loading and offloading missiles and warheads.
Can I ask just, I mean, maybe this is just a daft question, but I mean, is it, if we can have storage capacity in France, is it possible just to have loading capacity? I mean, as long as you're storing the missiles, you're loading them on the boats, and then the boats are sailing away. I mean, presumably it doesn't matter if you actually load them in France or indeed in the United States, as long as the British
we load the missiles
control.
In the United States.
Sorry?
We load the missiles in the United States. We don't own any Tridents.
Right.
They're all owned out in a general pool. When another boat goes on patrol, it's not that that's British Missile 1 and 2 and 3. That's Missile 7, then the other tube's got Missile 64. They are a joint stock of missiles. We have the right to access a certain number of missiles. We don't actually own any.
I think the option of having the Coolport facility in the United States was looked at when Trident was first purchased. And I think part of the reason why it was rejected was it was seen as just a step too far to being perceived as not being an independent deterrent if both your missile servicing and your warheads were based in the United States. It would have saved money. But there was also an issue at that time, which wasn't fully explored, but of whether the United States would be prepared to have a foreign nuclear weapon base on its territory. Or whether it would ask, well, if you're not even prepared to have your nuclear servicing done in your own country, then how serious are you about having an independent deterrent? I think in the case of France, it would be a different dynamic, and there may be a stronger French stake in Britain remaining a nuclear weapons state than there is an American stake in that. But even then, I think, for the French, I think it wouldn't be automatic that the French would be prepared to have a sovereign foreign nuclear weapon base on their territory. I mean, I think they would think twice about whether... No, but it's possible. I think it is an option, but I think it would be a difficult one.
And do remember, we are now doing we've just started, very early process of mutual dependency in nuclear design and testing.
Yes.
We are now totally reliant on the French for some areas, and they are now totally reliant on Burfield, the explosives facilities. On that basis, since you could say we have both given up our independence in nuclear weapons to the other, that without massive investment, it's only just ended, but we would not be able to get back all those areas. On that basis, I think it is, and having spoken with French on this, and God, if spoken 15 years ago, you would have had a load of Gaullists who would have just gone, no. This is not the case now. I've been following the French's drive back into NATO and so forth, seeing French units come over here, working with their British opposite numbers at all levels. The desire to be
in
like
a sense, the answer is that these things are not inconceivable. No. I mean, it is the issue, and I think the point you made at the beginning, Francis, is a very good one. I mean, and that is, we have just assumed, and I think we had just assumed that there was no solution save, the status quo. And in fact, the more we've discussed this, I mean, the thing that does strike me before I let you in is that this is more properly a matter for the Defence Select Committee. Because I think, as the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, we are interested in the Scottish dimension. That if there's going to be explorations of where else it might go, since presumably if it's moved out of that part of Scotland, it's not going to move to another bit of Scotland. It's not then really our sort of remit, as it were. But Ian, you wanted to pick up a
Yeah, regardless of the difficulty of handing over, or the ease of handing over the hardware, etc., because I'm pretty sure they're all cardboard anyway. The transfer of jobs as well. A lot of our constituents will work in these facilities, etc. Would the ease of transfer, you've already touched on probably a bonanza for certain parts of the other UK, jobs, etc. The ease of transfer of those jobs, and also the degree of skills that could be transferred or would be.
Well, I think partly comes down to when we're talking about the different regiments and whether people would sign up one way or the other. There will be some people who, if they were to hear, let us say that Faslane was closing down and it was all going to Devonport, might well decide they were going to move with the work. I think we should, one of the things perhaps either it helps or it's a problem if you're looking at jobs in Scotland, is of course, just for example, submarine support maintenance done by Babcock, who've got facilities both sides of the border. They have got flex capability to move either way. If there were different firms, sort of stovepiped firms, then it'd be more difficult. But the fact is, BAE Systems, Babcock, as the two, you could say, most Rolls-Royce, let alone, the 2.5 most important firms, have got facilities south of the border in different places with the requisite licences. From an industrial point of view, it's not just not inconceivable. For them, it just becomes a business operations matter that they move stuff to a different facility. Will there be some jobs which won't move because people don't want to move? Yes, there will be.
What seems inconceivable probably will affect that will be the fact that what will be replace those jobs that transfer, etc., from especially that area of the country.
Anyway, just come back to one I was making on engineers generally. If you are a specialist nuclear submarine engineer or something like that, and the job, and you love the job, and that job and the future of that job, much as the major wanting to get promotion to colonel and brigadier afterwards, that's moved to somewhere else.
You may not be persuaded to stay and work on our ferries. No?
Well, I'm not going to say there's an easy answer. I'm just saying it's not as clear cut that someone will say, no, thank you, I'm going to stay here, if the job you have trained for
and you are potentially a national leader in it, has just shifted 450 miles to the southwest.
Right. Well, look, can I mean, I'm conscious that Professor Strachan has got to be going off in a moment, and I know that Alan wanted to ask another point, and then we'll just draw things to a close if that's all right.
Yeah, so moving on to the next stage then, if we assume that the submarines have gone and a separate Scotland's left with all the facilities at Faslane that haven't been moved, I mean, would Scotland have a separate Scotland have any use for submarines, do you think?
It depends. It comes back to every question we've asked about Scottish capability, which is the political framework. But yes, of course there's a function for submarines, particularly if you're thinking about maritime defence. There could be a function for submarines. There is a presumption at the moment that they won't have them, well, Scotland won't have them, but actually it seems to be a very logical thing for Scotland to want to have.
Would it be a practical proposition?
Well, that's, again...
I think the key thing is, I think as Hew says, there might be a requirement for submarines, but it wouldn't be these submarines.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. These submarines, the Astute class submarines, are designed for global deployment. They've got very, very high capital and running costs. But it's the sort of thing that only a small number of major powers with defence budgets of 70, 80, 90 billion dollars a year can afford. So you'd have to think about what the shape of the Scottish Navy would be. They might, like I think Norway, have a couple of submarines.
Well, that's the whole point. If you look at, again, the comparator nations, the best ones, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, they have all got submarine forces. They are all modernising them.
And are these diesel submarines?
These are all diesel electric, but in certain areas with the modern technologies, they are as capable, as silent and so forth as the nuclear. So they are no longer the poor man's submarines. Some of them are actually incredibly expensive. Just again, as perhaps a weird aside in terms of nations and their submarine use, one of the key requirements the South Africans had when they bought their German submarines back a decade ago now was not force projection, it was not defence of the coastline, it was actually fisheries protection. Now that may sound really weird, but one of their ones was a submarine can be on station for a long time, whereas your aircraft goes out, does 2 hours and then disappears. And actually rogue fishermen are very good at working out that, hang on, the fisheries protection aircraft's just about to come over and they disappear. And one of the requirements for the periscopes from a certain company was to be able to identify and take photos of fishing boats which they could then raid and arrest. So I'm not suggesting that's the best reason to buy submarines, but it's interesting how different nations look at it.
Can I just interrupt you, because I know Professor Strachan's got his jacket on, so this is really getting serious now. I mean,
I've got two journals waiting for me. I know I've got to get there.
You name drop that. I mean, are there any other? I mean, what we're going to ask all of you at the end is whether or not there's any other points that you particularly think you want to raise with us, and secondly, if upon reflection there are points that you wish you'd either made to us or we'd asked you about, we would very much welcome, I think, any further correspondence. So, Professor Strachan, I mean, is there any point that you...
I don't think there's anything immediately. I would just say, I think it's been a constant theme throughout this, that actually the foreign policy question ought to come first.
Yeah.
And then we can, you can get much more sensible answers to many of the questions you're trying to address. If you have some sense of what the foreign policy would look like. But every answer that we've given has been contingent on that.
Fine. Thanks so much. Now, if you don't mind, there's a couple of other points we'll just clarify with the other two victims for the moment. Can I just clarify about the submarines? I mean, did any of these states build their own submarines?
In most, the Dutch did. But actually, because of the complexity of some of these platforms, more and more often you go to one of the two key developers, builders. That's either DCNS in France or ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems in Germany. If you then buy enough of them or are willing to put the money up, you can probably do licensed assembly in your own country. But then one not very good example of how to do this is the Greeks decided to buy some submarines from ThyssenKrupp, but then forgot to pay for them. And did start welding bits of hulls the wrong way up and so forth. So that one was not a particularly pleasant programme. But so in terms of conventional submarines, there is no UK design. There is no British yard.
But for Scotland, I mean, I was just thinking for Scotland, for separate Scotland, would it be feasible for a separate Scotland to build its own submarines?
Yes, it is absolutely feasible. Is there a learning curve? Yeah, because it is different from building a surface warship. Would almost, if the minimum number you have to do is 4. Below that, just the economies of scale are insane, because there aren't any. If you were building 4, the first one would almost certainly come out of either the TKMS yard in Germany, or would come out of the DCNS yard in France. They would take engineers and workers from Govan to those yards to show them how they're built. This is now relatively common. And if you looked at DCNS, they're building submarines with and for the Brazilian Navy, where precisely this practice happens. The first 1/2 get built in France, then the rest get built in country, and they do technology transfer. I wouldn't like to, strange for me, minimise some of the hiccups you can have. And there is a learning curve here, but it is doable. And quite frankly, any of the 2 submarine manufacturers, when they are selling submarines overseas, almost the first question is, do you want to build them yourself? Because then that changes how you market the submarines.
Right.
You mentioned 4 as being a minimum. Would Scotland need 4 submarines?
The reason I say 4 is not just industrially. If you look at support, training, and so forth, and actually then the investment in facilities, much less than that, and you are just spending a vast amount on sunk costs. 4, okay, and we don't actually need 4 SSBNs for constant at sea deterrence. Again, one of those inconvenient truths. 4 submarines allows 1 in maintenance, 1 doing stuff, 1 going out, and 1 probably just in training. 4 is about the minimum flotilla where you get the advantages.
The facilities that exist at Faslane at the moment for the nuclear submarines, would that be would that be of use to Scotland with, say, smaller diesel submarines? So right, so it wouldn't be starting completely from scratch.
The only one, coming back to the point thing Malcolm or Hew made, was of course the training would all have to happen down in Plymouth and down at Portsmouth, because that's where the facilities are. Would you ever want to try and replicate them? No. And for that reason, the Dutch and the Norwegians still send people over to Portsmouth, because it's just not economic for them to replicate those facilities. But no, as a facility, because you've got all the ways of handling submarines.
Other than when you mentioned fishery observation, what other uses would you envisage Scotland having for submarines?
Insurance policy is, of course, the broadest one. If you are, especially with oil, gas, rigs out at sea and so forth, having the ability to say, by the way, if you do fancy trying to sniff around some of our assets, we're in a position to stop you.
Now, you mentioned fishing and oil, and these are assets that tend to be in the North Sea, and Faslane's obviously up a sea loch on the west coast. Would you be advising a Scottish government to base its submarines at Faslane, or would you be looking at a fresh start on the east coast?
I think it would take advantage of what you said, is that if all the nuclear boats are heading south, you still have a workforce with expertise, knowledge of dealing with submarines. It's not something they're going to go, oh my God, what's this turning up? They will be used to it. The transition will be far, far simpler than if you were to try and transport a base somewhere totally different. You then have to build all the infrastructure again. If Scotland were to have submarines of any type, you would have to come up with an amazing defence and business case not to put them at Faslane.
Right. And for Scotland, any surface ships that Scotland had, fishery protection vessels, would it make sense to base them at Faslane as well, or somewhere else?
Well, whether you put some at Rosyth, but again, how many are we talking about?
Well, how many do you think?
If you're talking about, say, 3 frigates and 4 fishery patrols vessels, I suppose the best stroke worst is you'd say, let's, for the sake of argument, put the frigates at Rosyth, put the smaller vessels at Faslane. But quite frankly, if you are looking at that, again, at the comparator navies, even New Zealand and so forth, how many of them have 2, 3, 4 naval bases? No, they're pretty much down to 1 at naval base. Why? It just makes sense.
And I mean, could you make an estimate of the number of jobs that the Scottish Navy would support compared to the number of jobs that are supported by the Royal Navy?
I could find out figures for the size of the submarine bases in some of the comparator nations, if that would help.
Yeah, that would certainly be helpful if you could send that to
of course, you don't have the nuclear sides. You don't have all the safety people.
Yeah.
But Yeah.
Yeah, that would certainly be useful to have, yes. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, do you want to respond to any of that exchange?
Only to say, I think you could make these calculations for the Navy in isolation, but you have to look at the whole force structure, because the more you put emphasis on surface ships and submarines and buying, I mean, I think the key thing is that in all these areas in the Navy, there would be a lot of new buy by Scotland. You're not talking about inheriting. There isn't much to inherit that would be appropriate for Scotland, given its income and its strategic situation. To be new buy. So would you be able to get them on a sort of a long-term purchase agreement?
Or the second-hand ones about the world that
even second-hand isn't cheap. So would you have a procurement-dominated 10-year initial defence budget? I suspect you wouldn't. And what would happen is it would take a long time to build these capabilities. Have to make some really hard choices. If you made a choice, which you could do, to say we're going to get 4 Scottish submarines by 2025, then you're going to have to spend much less on aircraft or the army or whatever it might be.
And actually, if you are going to go for frigate submarines and so forth, with all the reasonable assumptions on the size of a budget, you are saying the Scottish Army will be smaller, because there is not the budget to pay for the manpower of a largish army, and then the equipment, the high-techy.
And you're convinced it would have to be new build. There aren't reasonably priced second-hand.
No, there are some. No, there will be a second-hand market.
Right. Greeks are actually selling. No, seriously, they are. But
if you don't buy new submarines and build them in Govan, then the Clyde shipyard's shut. No, I mean, which is the reality of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
So really, I mean, because if they're not building the Type 26, then there is no work.
Yeah.
And I think it's clear that you've said they won't be building the Type 26, and indeed that's what the Minister said.
Yeah.
So unless it's something like the Scottish Navy building new submarines, then there is just simply no work.
And if we were to say, coming back on the point of unlikely to, unless we do the card deal and basically all of the current offshore patrol vessels go to Scotland, so that the UK keeps all the Type 23s or something like that. Yeah. The other one is, of course, the workforce required for very sophisticated ships like Type 45. Compare that for the workforce you need to build an offshore patrol vessel like Corvette.
Totally different.
It's a percentage, and it's a small percentage.
Okay, thank you.
Well, look, thank you very much. I hope this hasn't been too much of an ordeal for you. I think we've found it immensely interesting. My head is now completely full. I mean, if there are any other points, as I said, that upon reflection you would want to draw to your attention, please drop us a note. We're seeing ministers immediately after the quick break, and I think given the scale of uncertainty, we'll be producing a pretty quick report, I think, focusing on the need for clarity and identifying a number of the possibilities and so on, rather than trying to answer lots of these questions, because in a sense we are not in favour of breaking up the union, and therefore we don't need to produce the answers. Somebody else needs to produce the answers, and I think what you've identified for us is that some of these things have got to be clarified as soon as possible. Well, again, thank you very much for coming along. Sorry for holding you a little longer than you might have expected. Order, order.